On his 15th birthday, the young man with golden hair knelt in the church before the old priest, listening closely to the solemn words that sounded like a blessing for the new stage of his life. After finishing the speeches, the priest looked up and announced that the young man must now set out on his first journey, because it was time for him to work and prove his own strength. With his hands folded in prayer and a faint smile, the young man offered words of thanks that closed a ceremony which acted as a rite, marking his career change and the start of a whole new path. After a while, the young man was racing across rocky ground after a creature that kept leaping as it tried to flee and hide from him while he shouted, demanding that it stop. Exhausted from the run, the boy could barely breathe, but still drove the creature to the edge of a steep cliff, then stopped, panted, and said he had finally caught up with it, frowning as he called it a slime. Clenching the dagger tighter, he smiled and lunged, saying the chase had given him a lot of trouble. But the slime, startled by the attack, bounced sharply to the side, avoiding the blow. Without warning, the creature leaped just above the boy's head and changed shape, making him miss as his blade cut only air. As he spun in confusion, slime wrapped around the arm that held his sword. The slime spread quickly, completely engulfed his palm, and began moving up his arm, and the boy screamed in fear, trembling as he tried to understand what was happening while forcing himself to stay calm. In reality, the boy wearing virtual goggles felt this world as he controlled a blonde-haired character. Gritting his teeth and trembling with tension, he told himself he could handle it, and with shaking hands, squeezed the slime that bound him. Suddenly he bit down on the slime and jerked it, breathing hard from the effort. And in his head, he told himself this was only the start. Finally, using all his strength, he tore the creature from his hand and broke free. Slime ripped from his hand, flew into the air, and the young man tightened his grip on the dagger, ready to strike, when the creature landed on the blade, prompting him to say the encounter had been rather pleasant. Pierced by the blade, the creature fell to the ground and spread out weakly, as if losing life drop by drop, and then a strange object began to emerge from its softened form, glowing with an unusual hue. Breathing a sigh of relief and rubbing his hand, the young man sat down beside the dead creature, saw an object sticking out of the defeated enemy's body, and when he picked it up, he realized it was a magic stone. Tossing the found magic stone a few times, the boy noticed with interest that it glowed. Excited, he loudly ordered to open its status. The status window showed his name was Jade, and that he was still a novice. Then he noticed something unusual. One free skill point had appeared, and his eyes widened in surprise. Jade was overjoyed. He threw the dagger into the air, fell onto his back on the grass, and shouted that it was incredibly cool as he felt true happiness from his first victory. On the cold grass, Jade sighed with a smile and looked up at the clear sky where white clouds drifted like sails. Then he thought about the amazing world he was meant to live in. Meanwhile, a loud shout filled the grand manor as someone angrily demanded an explanation. A hoarse-voiced man kept insisting the boy's ritual to change professions had failed. A bearded man with a stern look scolded Jade, who bowed his head and quietly said he was sorry and would make it right. But the man suddenly shouted for him to leave, making the boy's eyes widen in shock. Turning sharply, the man jabbed a finger at the boy and demanded to know why he had gone back to being a rookie, his shout sounding like a verdict as he called it a disgrace to everyone who had counted on him. That man was Jade's father. After scolding his son thoroughly, he turned away and began rummaging in a drawer, when Jade suddenly dared to ask him to wait, as if a flicker of hope had appeared that he did not want to lose. As soon as the boy spoke those words, all his hopes vanished. his father suddenly stopped the search and tossed a small pouch at him, and a stunned Jade barely managed to catch it right in front of his face. Turning to the drawer, his father closed it and said coldly that the time had come and they had to say goodbye. Jade stood frozen, clutching the simple cloth pouch. Suddenly, the father spun around, looked him straight in the eye, and declared he no longer considered Jade his son. Shouting, he ordered him to leave the house immediately. Head down and clutching the tossed bag, Jade walked along the street, biting his lip and looking at the ground, unable to believe his own father had rejected him so cruelly. Pouring a few coins into his palm, the only money he had, the boy bitterly recalled that his father always cared more about what others thought than about his own family. Jade could never have believed that his father would turn away from him so suddenly. Lost in heavy thoughts, he walked silently along the empty road, passing a roadside sign. Looking up sadly, the young man thought painfully that his father valued money more than family, and a cold thought ran through him that he might be destined to die here so ingloriously. Still, Jade watched the pure white clouds drifting calmly across the sky and thought about what to do next. Suddenly, his eyes opened wide in horror as he clutched his head and gritted his teeth. At the same moment, his body rose from the ground and was flooded with bright light, forcing the boy to cover his face with his hands. He parted his lips in surprise when the sudden pain vanished just as quickly, and the world around him began to change before his eyes into something completely different. Flashes of a stranger's life passed before him, and at first, Jade could not tell he was seeing his own past. But then he realized it was himself in a completely different world. He once lived in Japan, in a world very different from today. There, Jade was obsessed with a VR game called NSO and spent countless hours fully immersed. All the memories that flooded back were tied to NSO. Through steady training and growth, he climbed to the top of the player rankings, and the game became the key to the world he now lived in. NSO was not the only game of its kind, and others let new players grow from an ordinary level into a power that could match the world's strongest. Jade wondered why a newcomer could not become the strongest, and immediately told himself the reason lay in the very foundation of the game. The newcomer had boundless potential, like an uncut diamond, holding the power of every possible profession, just waiting to be discovered. In the game he once lived for, every player could learn any profession's skills, and even a beginner could match the most powerful abilities. When the pain eased, Jade, breathing hard, pulled his hands off his head, straightened up, and looked around, and then noticed something that stunned him. His eyes froze in amazement. The world around him strangely resembled the same NSO where he had spent so much time, and the realization hit him like a blow. Still stunned, cold sweat ran down his face when something moved below, and a small, fluffy creature sat beside him, and Jade realized he was looking at a world at the very start of civilization. Remembering his right to switch professions, he thought there were many paths, but knights and mages were always exceptions. Gritting his teeth, Jade decided to see everything for himself. Tensing, he reached forward and gave the command to open the status. At that moment, a status screen unfolded before him. Stunned, he gasped, then laughed and smiled triumphantly. With his hands raised in triumph, he was so happy he even scared a nearby animal, and he thought that if this really was the NSO world, even a newcomer like him could become the strongest. Soon, Jade arrived in town after crossing the Sanzu River, found a weapon shop, and spent his last money on a new knife. Hunting small, simple monsters earned him skill points, but he knew that wouldn't be enough for real power unless he wanted to spend his life chasing only slugs. Lying on the cool grass, Jade smiled broadly, holding the magic crystal in his hand and thinking he had already earned 1 point, so he should aim higher. Standing up and stretching his stiff body, the boy felt rested enough and set out to hunt again, since without new skill points he could not gain any power. The hunt for slugs continued, and Jade searched everywhere for prey until he found a slug stuck to a rock. When it tried to escape, he quickly caught up and killed it without hesitation. But the slugs did not always give up so easily, using the same sneaky trick as before to wrap their soft bodies around Jade's arms and legs and wear him down until he was exhausted and irritated. After 2 hours, the boy laid out on the cloth everything he had found, his eyes shining with wonder and joy, because he had managed to collect more than 10 magic stones. It would have been enough to stop there, but Jade would not settle for less. Sitting on the grass, he opened his status and carefully scanned the long list of skills. From the list, the boy chose the search skill, which required 10 skill points. Finally, he sighed and pressed confirm, deciding to learn the skill. At that moment, the system's cold, emotionless voice sounded in his mind and announced he had gained a skill. Hearing it again, Jade clutched his head because the sound felt eerie and chilled him to the bone. Once calm, the boy decided to try his new ability right away. Speaking the command aloud, he activated the search and waited tensely for the result. Closing his eyes, Jade suddenly sensed several living beings nearby, and that awareness came from his new skill. He opened his eyes, and a joyful smile spread across his face. Pointing eagerly in that direction, he told himself a slime was hiding there and had left signs of its presence. Satisfied, Jade smiled, knowing this skill would make it much easier to find slimes that hid well, and he clenched his fist in relief that he would no longer be caught by surprise attacks. Standing up, he touched the pouch at his belt and realized he only had magic stones for now, so he had to decide the best way to use them. Back in town, Jade breathed a sigh of relief and soon found the sign he needed, went inside, approached the bearded man at the counter, and rented a room for the night. At night, the young man sat at a simple wooden table, lit only by a dim lamp, and carefully carved the spells he needed into the magical crystals. After carefully checking his work, he decided to try to make a magical weapon, holding a stone whose surface already showed a glowing carved magic circle. Only wizards used to make weapons like this, but with his skills and the materials he collected, Jade could now craft one himself, even doing the intricate engraving. While carefully drawing magic circles in his notebook, he remembered that in a past life, he had been a pro who knew every pattern and formula from his favorite game, NSO. He worked steadily, thinking about his past. At last, the first stone was ready, but 9 more remained. Jade realized the in-game item could only be obtained at the end. Carefully carving engravings into the stones, the young man thought no skill could do this automatically. It was hard, painstaking work that could only be done by hand. After long hours of hard work, Jade finally finished all the stones and collapsed onto the bed, exhausted, stretching and yawning. He thought that starting tomorrow, collecting materials would be completely different for him. The next morning, the young man set out to hunt again. Armed with the magical tool he had made the day before, he moved through the forest and immediately activated the search to avoid wasting time. Dense thickets had sapped his strength, but Jade smiled broadly when his skill detected prey nearby. Hidden behind a trunk, he waited, tense, for the right moment. The target was a fierce monster that looked like a giant boar. Jade knew even an experienced fighter would have trouble beating it in a fair fight. The first fight with the monster like that can be deadly, so he pulled out the magic stone and whispered to the beast not to hold it against him for what would happen next. After saying those words, Jade hid behind a tree because the boar lifted its head warily, and the monster began to roam the clearing, snorting contentedly, then suddenly stopped and growled as it sensed danger. Standing behind a tree, the boy trembled with tension, his teeth clenched and cold sweat running down his face. Unsure if the beast had noticed him, he shouted the command to change the stone before it attacked. In an instant, the stone in his hand vanished, and a larger, more powerful one appeared. Jade clenched it in his palm and smiled. Everything was exactly as he had planned. The moment a new stone flashed in the boy's hands, the boar shuddered, let out a sharp scream, and losing strength, collapsed heavily to the ground, showing no sign of life. Drawing the dagger from its sheath, Jade briefly remembered learning yesterday how to swap one stone for another taken from a monster, and that skill had become his main weapon. Now, the boy could easily get magic crystals even from enemies much stronger than him, and this gave him a huge advantage. With that in mind, he approached the fallen beast. Kneeling over the boar's body, Jade closed his eyes and reached out. Immediately, he felt the monster's magical barrier vanish without a trace, thanks to his new ability, and realized that this was the greatest advantage he could gain. The magical barrier that had been boosting the monsters vanished when Jade pulled the stone from the boar's body. With his lips pressed together, the boy raised his dagger over the fallen enemy. After finishing the task, Jade let out a relieved breath and wiped his brow. He thought that every monster had its own stone, a source of power that kept its body going and powered all its abilities. Unlike the slugs he'd hunted before, the boars carried much larger, far more powerful crystals. Jade raised his hand and ordered the map to open. With the new boar crystal, the boy felt much more confident than before. It occurred to him that he could now replace the boar stone with the slime stone, which didn't suit that creature at all. This let the young man completely weaken the enemy by stripping away his mana and protective barrier. Seeing he had already amassed a full 100 skill points, Jade felt pleased to reach his first major milestone in his growth. The replacement skill's purpose was to weaken someone else's magic stone. Rising to his feet, the boy kept smiling, genuinely pleased by that small but important achievement. Still, he knew this ability had limits. It did not work on certain creatures and was powerless against dragons. Smiling, Jade hurried away from where the boar had fallen. Sitting by a stream of icy water, he cupped some in his hands and washed his face, thinking the skill worked only against mid-level monsters and could sometimes be useless. Wiping his face, Jade stood and scanned the area, and then he noticed something at his side that made him wary. Quickly slipping behind a tree, he put his hand on the sword's hilt. Peeking around the trunk, the boy spotted a huge beehive hanging from a branch and a swarm of buzzing insects circling it. Squinting, Jade recognized the insects as wasps. A nest of giant wasps stood before him, so he activated a scan to see what was inside the hive. Clenching his fist, the boy counted 2 large wasps on the surface, 6 inside, and 9 flying nearby. He concluded most of the swarm had gone out to find food. Clutching the dagger tighter, Jade thought beginners usually avoided such dangerous creatures, since without mentors nearby, they had almost no chance of surviving. Facing the swarm alone seemed nearly impossible, but seeing the handful of magic stones in his hand, he confidently decided he had a chance to win this time. He raised the crystal and activated the swap skill. The stones instantly rose into the air and glowed with bright light, as if answering his call. In the next moment, they vanished, and at the same time, the wasps that were flying and crawling suddenly froze, and above Jade's head, new stones appeared, the ones he had just pulled from those creatures. The paralyzed wasps fell to the ground one by one, completely drained of power. Jade clenched the wasp's magic stones in his hands, feeling a true victory. Crouching beside one of the axles, the boy reached out with a dagger, knew it was too dangerous to act alone, told himself he had to survive, and then without hesitation drove the blade into the enemy. Soon Jade sat on a fallen tree with one leg stretched out in a relaxed pose. Killing the wasps earned him a full 500 experience points, and he decided to learn a new skill that cost 100 points. A system voice sounded in his head, announcing that Jade had learned the storage skill, and the boy, curious, raised a finger, gave the command, and it opened instantly. His new ability let him store several items at once, even very bulky ones, and excited, he stood up and walked toward the now empty hive. He realized he could retrieve the items at any time, and after storing everything Jade said, it was a handy travel skill that would let him train and sell found materials for profit. Just as he was leaving, he suddenly remembered something important. Sighing, he turned and walked the other way. Jade returned to the boar's body he had defeated earlier, sat on the ground, and drew in the dirt with a stick, surprised he hadn't gained such a useful ability sooner. After drawing a table of numbers, the boy realized the new skill had serious limits, so he could only take the boar once he strengthened his storage further. Jade stood up, rubbed their chin thoughtfully, decided to triple the storage, and the system immediately confirmed the upgrade succeeded. To be sure, he activated the skill again. Reaching out, he watched the storage open right above his head and said with delight that it had grown much larger. Clasping his hands together, he suddenly reached forward and opened a compartment beside the boar, smiling as he said he could now easily take the kill with him, then moved on. Soon the young man arrived at a place where several large buildings stood, side by side. It was the Adventurers Guild. Jade approached the door, where a notice listed the rules for visitors. Reading them, he wondered if he could sell his loot here. Clicking one of the listings, the young man found himself in a hall full of people busy trading trophies. Jade called the girl at the counter, opened the storeroom, and reached in. Grabbing the boar's horns, he tried to pull it out and shouted that he wanted to sell the catch. The stunned girl rushed to him. It was the girl Jade had called. She hurriedly pushed up her slipping glasses and, clutching a book, asked him anxiously what he was doing, while the boy, bewildered, let go of the boar and froze in indecision. Awkwardly scratching the back of his head, he finally mumbled that he was just trying to make a little money and that the boar was only his baggage. And then it struck him that storing things might not be a universal skill for all beginners. Jade remembered that beginners usually used bags with bottomless pockets, so storage wasn't a problem. Moving closer, she studied him with a careful, suspicious look. Not finding a better explanation, the boy feigned indifference, shrugged, and said it was just simple storage magic. The girl, surprised, asked him again. Pushing her glasses higher on her nose, she studied Jade more closely and said she had never heard of that kind of magic. He pretended everything was fine, and she sighed and decided not to press him further. Smiling, she held out her hand and asked to see his adventurer's ID. Jade said nothing as she watched him expectantly, and he finally admitted he had none. The girl raised her voice sharply and demanded to know how this could happen, since travel is allowed only with an official certificate. Jade explained he had only recently started his craft. After she went over to the fallen boar and sat beside him, he scratched his head again and awkwardly said that even if he registered, he might still fail the entrance exam. The girl turned to him and said he was very strange. Raising an eyebrow, she said it was hard to believe someone could beat a boar and still fear failing an exam, her voice full of disbelief and challenge. Jade had not expected that reaction, but he could not answer directly because the replacement skill could not be explained on the spot, so he stayed silent and left her question unanswered. Finally, the girl stood up and said she would buy a boar from him, but he had to register in return. The boy ran a hand over his forehead and sighed with relief when he heard that. With his eyes closed, he thought maybe passing the exam would be easier, but he now lacked the real skills to defend or attack, so success remained far from certain. He suddenly opened his eyes, struck by the thought that he had one more trump card that could be decisive. He said he would definitely pass the exam. The girl jumped up with joy, grabbed his hands, and said that if he passed, it would make life much easier for both of them. After catching her breath, she put a hand to her chest and smiled, saying she had forgotten to introduce herself. Her name was Sylvia, and she was the one who admitted new recruits to the Adventurers Guild. Jade squeezed her hand, introduced himself, and said he was pleased to meet her, and Sylvia, having finished the formalities, invited him to follow her to see the main hall. Later, reading his application, she looked up and, a little puzzled, said his name. Watching him closely, Sylvia doubted whether Jade was really a beginner. He immediately confirmed it was true. Sylvia felt a shiver when Jade answered without hesitation. Gathering herself, she solemnly declared that in that case he had no chance of passing the exam. Jade stayed calm. He said it was not over and asked if there were other ways to stage the trials. The girl hesitated briefly and reluctantly admitted such methods existed. She smiled and said she would make an exception for the one who had killed the boar. Jade crossed his arms on the table and thought skeptically that he did not really believe her. Just as she was leaving, Sylvia stopped and told him to wait because she needed to call the examiner. A heavy step sounded behind Jade. He turned and cried out as a giant 5 times his size stood before him. The giant put a hand on his shoulder and asked if he wanted to sign up as an adventurer. Jade looked up at him, stunned, and could not get a word out. When the guy finally looked back, the man folded his arms across his chest and introduced himself as Ramon, saying that if Jade failed the exam, he would destroy the monster himself in his place. Ramon shrugged and said it would be wiser to know your limits and give up the idea of becoming an adventurer. But Jade looked up at him and replied firmly that she would not change her mind. Smiling, he said he would definitely pass the exam and not fail it because he was confident in his abilities. Ramon smiled and replied that if Jade chooses that goal himself, he has the drive to take on the big monsters. And without waiting for a response, he ordered him to listen carefully. They headed to the western forest for the trial. Jade looked around, frowned, and smiled quietly. Ramon, also pushing through the trees, heard the laughter, looked at the boy in surprise, and called his name. Noticing Jade was walking too confidently, as if she already knew where the monster for the exam was hiding, the boy leaned against a tree and said he really knew where it was. Ramon asked skeptically whether that meant Jade had some special tracking magic, then sneered and joked that he was supposed to be a hunting dog who could sniff out monsters. Ignoring his companion's mocking words, Jade looked away and thought the creature they needed was already nearby and would be extremely strong, even for seasoned warriors. The young man suddenly stopped, reached out, and pointed confidently into the bushes, saying the monster was hiding right there. Ramon, getting no answer to his questions, simply sighed, gave a crooked smile, and shrugged indifferently. Seeing where Jade pointed and what was hiding there, his face twisted in terror, and he shouted to the boy, begging him to step back immediately. Jade looked at him without expression and asked why he should back down. Ramon then asked whether he realized what kind of monster they were facing. The young man replied calmly that he knew it was an earthquake and asked his companion to confirm he was not mistaken. The earthquake was a huge white monkey that devoured smaller monsters. Jade realized the monster's name was well-deserved. The ground shook under its feet, and its strength was truly colossal, so the name matched its nature. Because of its vast power, the earthquake gained another name, the destroyer of armies, since it could wipe out entire units of soldiers. This time, Jade relied on his own switching technique, smiling boldly as he tossed the magic stone into the air. Having caught him, the young man confidently told himself that the earthquake would be a relatively easy prize. Ramon screamed in a panic, demanding to know how Jade could walk towards such a monster when he knew it would destroy them, and the boy clutched his head and covered his ears. Turning to face the monster, Jade realized it was too late to retreat because the earthquake had noticed them long before they got close. Ramon turned away in despair and covered his head with his hands, while Jade kept calmly watching the monster, thinking that soon his companion would realize he could kill it on his own. Ramon covered his head with his hands and muttered that it was the end for them, that they couldn't defeat such a beast on their own. Then Jade, clutching a stone, turned and told him to listen carefully. Raising the glowing stone higher, he said his fighting methods seemed strange, then asked if he was allowed to use only one magical tool in the fight with the monster. Ramon shouted that he could do anything because it would not save them from death in the fight against the earthquake. And hearing agreement, Jade let go of the stone, and it slowly floated upward. The youth activated his swap skill, and the stone glowed even brighter, sending beams in every direction. And hearing the sound behind it, the monster turned with a menacing roar. Instantly, Jade's power surged as the slime stone in his hands turned into a seismic crystal. And when the monster lost its own, it roared with fury. Then it hit the ground with a heavy thud and went unconscious. Ramon froze in shock, unable to believe that such a powerful beast had fallen so easily. Ramon jumped up, pointed at Jade, and demanded an explanation for what he had just done. The boy replied, confused, that he had only used his ability. Ramon asked again. Jade said he had simply swapped the crystals, so a foreign stone now lay in the Earthshaker's body, and because it was too weak, the monster's energy faded and it fainted. Ramon rubbed the bridge of his nose, sighed deeply, and said they had defeated such a powerful beast with some nonsense, while Jade only stood silently holding the stone in her hands. Turning back to the unconscious monster, he thought it had gotten what it deserved, and then slowly sat on a nearby rock. Jade opened the storage and put the magic crystal inside. He thought giving the monster a weak stone could kill it by shock despite its strength. One strike would be enough to finish it. The boy remembered that Earthshakers have tough hides but vulnerable eyes, and newcomers can't even reach those spots, so the only thing left is to keep moving forward and push through the fear. Ramon looked at the boy sitting on the rock with surprise, then lunged forward and said they could now finish off the monster, telling Jade to leave everything else to him. Ramon drew his sword from behind his back and moved to deliver the final blow to the Earthshaker, but Jade jumped up and firmly told him to wait because it was his exam and he could not pass if he got help. Ramon fell silent in surprise, then awkwardly agreed and mumbled an apology. Jade sighed with relief and said we just had to wait, and the monster would die on its own. Even so, the boy felt he was severely lacking skills, so he looked down and opened the control panel, which showed he currently had 400 skill points. Jade rose from the rock and turned to the Earthshaker lying motionless on the ground. He made sure the creature was dead and sighed softly. After the monster died, Jade received the same 400 skill points and chose to upgrade his storage. The system said it had been upgraded by 4 levels. The boy smiled and considered his next move. He used the storage to place the dead Groundshaker's body inside. The storage's expansion made it easy, and the monster vanished in a flash of light. Ramon, surprised, demanded to know from the boy where the monster's body had gone. Jade, closing the storage and smiling, told him it had happened because of his magic. Hearing the explanation, the man was stunned and asked again if it was true. Jade nodded smugly and confirmed that it was indeed his own magic. Scratching his cheek awkwardly, the boy turned to Ramon and asked whether he was considered to have passed the exam. Ramon, surprised by the change in mood, laughed and confirmed that Jade had passed. Ramon said the young man truly understands combat, so a bright future in the guild awaits him. Returning from the forest on their way to the Adventurers Guild, they met Sylvia, who waved and smiled. Jade returned the gesture, lifting a hand in greeting. Coming closer, Sylvia greeted them warmly and immediately asked how the young man's exam had gone. Ramon, full of admiration, loudly praised Jade, saying he'd done something incredible, and even asked Sylvia to raise his rank right away, leaving her frozen with surprise. Adjusting her glasses, she asked again in disbelief if he was joking, and when he shook his head, Sylvia turned sharply and ran to the guild, saying she would call the guildmaster. Jade sighed helplessly, thinking he only wanted to register to sell the loot, and they're already trying to promote him somewhere. Soon, the elderly guildmaster appeared, asking in surprise what had happened, and whether Ramon really meant that the novice Jade was nearly as strong as a B-rank warrior, and Sylvia, out of breath from running, stood beside him. Ramon put his hand on Jade's annoyed head and eagerly described every detail of what happened during the exam. The guildmaster listened, stroked his beard thoughtfully, and hesitated to believe. But Ramon insisted that Jade had a special storage magic and said he could prove it. After that, the guildmaster turned to Sylvia and asked her opinion. Sylvia smiled and said she had seen Jade open their vault herself. After a moment's thought, the master told Ramon that if it was all true, he should have Jade show him the storage magic in person. They approached the guild building and stepped under its roof. Jade raised her hand and opened the storeroom so everyone could see. Then he told the people nearby to step back. When they did, the young man raised his other hand and fully opened the hiding place, pulling out the earth shaker. A giant monster's body hit the floor with a loud crash and smashed through it. Sylvia and the master gaped. Ramon folded his arms proudly over his chest, and Jade was simply surprised the beast had broken the floor. His eyes widened in surprise, and the bearded guildmaster said it was indeed the body of that same monster. Looking back into the storage, Jade said he had something else to show and asked if Ramon had already told them, then pulled out a magic earthquake crystal and said it could replace the monster's stones. The master froze, taking in what he'd heard, while Sylvia, recovering from the shock, said with delight that it was amazing, and now she understood how Jade had defeated such a powerful monster. She remembered the boar Jade had brought to sell before the exam. The girl explained that when they took his body apart, they found no magic stone. Taking out an item wrapped in cloth, she showed only fragments instead of a whole stone. Unfolding the cloth, Sylvia showed Jade fragments of slime rock and said that everyone had been very surprised at the time. The guildmaster said the crystal replacement method turned out to be the boy's main weapon. Jade calmly confirmed this. At last, the old man smiled and said that if Jade proves her strength, there will be no problems. He added that special arrangements would be made for the exam. Hearing this, Jade smiled sincerely, and Ramon clenched his fist triumphantly behind him. Soon, a certificate sat on a tray in front of Jay, and Sylvia solemnly announced it proved he was an adventurer. Holding the ID and studying it with curiosity, Jade heard Sylvia say that according to Ramon, they had originally planned to register him right away as a B-rank adventurer. She sighed and said that Jade's strength and combat skills could have doubled or even tripled since then. But things turned out differently, and he was registered as an E-rank adventurer on the G2S scale. Sylvia smiled and pushed her glasses up on the bridge of her nose, explaining that he is now a 3-star conqueror. And Jade asked in surprise whether that means he is now a 3-star Crusader-level warrior. She readily confirmed it and said there is a system to request a higher rank based on the number of stars, so in his case he could qualify for rank B. Jade, overflowing with joy, said it was incredible and thanked Sylvia sincerely for her help. Sylvia smiled in return, then, as if remembering something, turned sharply. She held a tray full of coins and told the boy it was payment for the materials he had handed in today, with exactly 40,000 gold coins on it. When Jade held out his hands, the girl added that the giant wasp nest cost 30,000 and the boar 13, with 3,000 taken off for inspection, making a neat total of 40,000. Opening the safe, he put in the money he'd earned and thought he could stop worrying about his finances for a while. With deep gratitude, he thanked Sylvia again. The girl awkwardly waved her hands when he bowed, told him not to, and asked him to come back to the guild because she would be glad to see him again. Jade left the building that evening. Hurrying back to the hotel, he easily dispatched a few slimes that crossed his path. In his room, he carved magical stones late into the night, yawning from fatigue. The next morning, refreshed, Jade set out to hunt again and decided to try a new strategy to gather mana more efficiently. He tested 20 different tactics to prepare, then spent another 50 points to improve search 3 times, and, thinking it over, activated the skill. The upgrade significantly extended the range. Soon, Jade glanced aside, pleased to have found the prize she had been looking for. Cautiously, he moved forward, and the scan showed there were 2 wild boars, 15 giant wasps, 6 mole monsters, and even 1 underground worm in the forest. Opening the storage, Jade took out the needed item, the boar's magic stone he had obtained yesterday. He activated the replacement technique, and the glowing stone rose up. Upon using the skill, all the monsters he had found suddenly turned toward him, staring in surprise at the spot where the boy stood. Bright beams of light burst from the ground toward Jade, and the boar stone absorbed all that power. A huge pillar of light burst from the crystal, kicking up dust around it, and the stone slowly began to crumble and shrink. A black funnel opened in the sky above him, and strange creatures began to descend from it. The monsters surrounding him suddenly took on wolf-like forms. Jade looked at the wolves surrounding him. Each had 4 eyes and bared its teeth at him. He said he now understood everything. Frowning, he remembered these creatures were called phantoms, wolf demons, born from a magical substance. They absorb any energy, resist magic, and are nearly invulnerable. The wolf demons have no physical bodies and are made only of energy, so replacing the stones could kill everything nearby. Jade regretted not noticing this sooner and picked up the stones. He tossed them into the air and activated his power. The stones glowed and began pulling the wolves inward, and within seconds, round cores fell to the ground at his feet. Holding one in his palm, he realized it was a phantom core, a magic stone that can restore a person's mana. Jade opened the storage and began stacking all the cores that hit the floor with dull thuds, thinking those stones would fetch a fortune on the black market. The young man suddenly got upset and wondered why he hadn't done anything about it yet. He deliberately triggered a magical catastrophe with phantoms, then dropped the last core into the vault and heard a loud splash. Jade figured magical instruments won't activate until the right spell is cast on them, but if it works, they can run continuously. This time, nothing happened. The process was stopped by a phenomenon called a magical catastrophe. The magical catastrophe absorbs all the energy, destroys weak monsters, and creates new, much stronger ones, filled with immense power. You can only kill the phantom with more than 300 SP, and the reward is a rare stone called a phantom core. After checking his status, Jade thought he could do both at once. Suddenly, Jade was surprised to find he had two new skills, an unexpected but inspiring discovery. Quick regeneration boosted physical abilities and healed the body, while martial arts helped apply hand-to-hand moves in combat. Jade raised them to +4, but that was still not enough. On his way, he caught a reed monster and used a magic circle to gain 7 more phantoms. That raised his regeneration to +7 and his combat arts to +6. After warming up, he decided to test his strength. Looking around for something to practice on, he spotted a large rock that was perfect and walked up to give it a light kick. A single, seemingly weak strike sent a huge boulder into the air, and it landed dozens of meters away. Jade stared, stunned, and realized he had gained inhuman strength. His hand in his pocket, he sighed softly, a little sad because he wanted to find a worthy opponent to show his strength. And when he looked around, Jade suddenly saw exactly what he had been looking for. A monkey-like monster sat in a nearby tree, calmly chewing something, and Jade immediately realized it was a shadow monster and decided it was perfect for testing his powers. The shadow monster was the same rank as the earthquake, though it lacked its raw physical strength. Its attacks were still dangerous. When it spotted the young man, the creature tensed and leapt down from the tree. Standing directly in front of the enemy, Jade wondered whether he could defeat him without using magic. The idea seemed like a perfect test, so Jade decided to act. The shadow monster snarled fiercely. The next moment, the beast lunged at Jade, stretching out a paw to strike. The boy scowled, sidestepped in time, and the monster only slashed at the air with its claws. Jade was struck by how strong this opponent was, but he immediately kicked the monster squarely in the neck. After the blow, the boy jumped aside, and the monster hit the ground with a loud thud. Rising, it snarled angrily and turned to face Jade. The young man, wearing an awkward smile, thought the shadow monster was furious, but he had already learned how predictable its movements were and knew how to use that to his advantage. Clenching his fist, Jade prepared for the enemy's new lunge, now charging at him to avenge the unexpected strike. The monster was already very close and lifted its paw for another strike, but Jade dodged and the blow missed, buying him half a second. While the monster was still stunned by its miss, Jade lifted his hand and delivered a kick so powerful, the creature flew dozens of meters and slammed into the ground, and he watched calmly. Barely standing on trembling paws, the monster pushed itself up, its muzzle soaked in blood. It lowered its head, signaling it would try a different tactic. Leaning forward, the shadow monster lunged at the boy again. Jade watched it closely and noticed a pattern in its attacks he could use. He realized the monster was still too easy to read, so at the decisive moment, Jade jumped and landed above the enemy, grabbing its paws to stop it from moving. With his knee pressed to the monster's head, he thought the enemy's second mistake was charging head-on. The monster always tilted its head up when attacking and never looked around, so Jade could easily predict its moves. This time, the creature was already flying straight toward a rocky ledge. The blow was aimed at the rock, but his paws were bound and he could not dodge. At the last moment, Jade jumped off his back to avoid being hit himself. The shadow monster's body slammed into a small hill, breaking it apart. Jade landed and looked at the creature lying motionless among the rocks. He opened the control panel, saw he had 150 points, which rose to 230 after the win, then opened the storage and put the monster's body away to sell later. Smiling, He felt he had easily defeated the enemy without using the substitution technique that had previously beaten the Earthshaker, and Jade even jumped with joy as he realized he was growing stronger. At dusk, the young man walked down the road, humming to himself. Then he noticed something and went quiet when he saw a group of armed men moving along the forest path. Peering cautiously from behind the tree, Jade saw that the largest of them was carrying a girl's body on his shoulder. They spoke among themselves. The man with the eye patch said the item would sell quickly, and the burly giant said they would get a huge sum for it. Jade frowned on hearing this. The young man sighed deeply, thinking he shouldn't interfere, but also realizing he could not just walk past, so he decided to act. Rising to his feet, he saw a chance to help the person and also gain a new level. And because he had used earth magic against the monsters, he now had the opportunity to learn another skill. Jade grimly activated a new skill by entering code 2014, unlocking the new ability called Murder. He felt a cold resolve inside as he prepared to test it for the first time. Ready for the fight, the young man dashed forward in pursuit of the bandits. Seeing 3 people ahead, he realized he had caught up and had to act fast. Hiding behind a tree to avoid being seen, the young man looked down, spotted a few pebbles on the ground, and immediately knew how to use them. Jade picked up a stone and threw it at the tree the hooded bandit was walking past. Hearing the dull thud, the bandit turned warily and reached for the weapon at his belt, and at that moment, Jade rushed in to attack. Footsteps sounded at his side, and the robber only managed a surprise turn, but it was already too late, and Jade kicked him hard in the chest. A heavy blow sent blood to the robber's throat, and he choked, vainly trying to draw breath. After striking, Jade paused for a moment to watch the enemy fall, then heard the other bandits shout and moved to the side, hiding behind a tree to avoid being seen. While hiding, he watched excited bandits rush to the fallen comrade. When Jade checked his status, he saw his SP had increased and confirmed his suspicion. The man with the eye patch asked what had happened. His partner put the girl on the ground and said someone was trying to stop them. Jade was convinced that defeating them would earn even more points. He knew that special bonuses were awarded for defeating bandits and dangerous criminals. That meant stunning and paralyzing enemies to finish them later. This was the best tactic. He also understood that even if he killed everyone, his SP would not grow forever. The bandit with the bandage ordered them to stay together and not let their guard down. Pulling out his dagger, Jade thought he would earn 10 points for disarming them. Having quickly confirmed they were real bandits, he immediately disarmed one of them. Emerging from behind the tree, he decided he would not spare them. The bandit with the headband turned toward him when he saw Jade walking with a dagger in her hand. He sneered and asked who the boy was. Jade answered coldly that while his body is still a child's, his mind and soul belong to an adult warrior. He doesn't care that he's unemployed. A burly bandit pointed at him and asked how a young man like that could be a novice. The one-eyed man called it a bluff and warned that if it was not, the consequences would be terrible. He rushed at Jade, vowing to cut him to pieces if he was not lying. The boy also rushed forward and swung his blade. The bandit parried the blow and gave a sinister smile, calling Jade a fool for thinking she could beat him. Then his eyes widened in shock. Frowning, Jade opened the vault and pulled out a magic crystal. Immediately, he hurled a stone at the enemy's head, determined to end the fight. A stone struck him in the head, and the robber died instantly. It happened in front of his companion, who, furious, rushed at Jade. The burly thug lunged and swung a massive fist. Jade skillfully dodged, and the punch hit the ground. At the same moment, the young man struck back. His fist landed squarely on the enemy's jaw, the force sending the man several meters back into a tree with a deafening crack. Jade raised his fist, convinced he was powerful and not someone to mess with, then looked at the girl lying unconscious. She was still bound by ropes, so the young man immediately cut them and freed her hands and feet. Jade sat beside her, trying to figure out how to bring her round. But without enough points, it was difficult. So he frantically searched for a solution. Looking up, he saw two large birds in the sky, and when he looked closer, he realized they were eagles. So he deliberately stood where they could notice him and come closer. As the birds began to descend, Jade pulled two slime stones from his stash and pinched them between his fingers, then swapped out their crystals, and the eagles cried out in horror. They lost the ability to move and fell to the ground like stones, sending up a cloud of feathers, and Jade, holding their stones in his hands, thought the eagles had arrived at exactly the right moment for him. After finishing them with his sword, he thanked the eagles for their help. Opening the panel, he felt a surge of power. Reaching out, he sent magic to the unconscious girl. Her eyes opened slowly. Jade was glad to see she had regained consciousness. Rubbing her eyes sleepily, the girl asked where she was, and then, seeing the unconscious bandit, screamed in fright. She grabbed Jade, and when she realized it, she jumped back, flustered, and hurriedly apologized. The guy reassured her that the enemy had passed out and wasn't a threat. Barely conscious, the girl murmured that she could not remember how she had ended up here. She asked Jade for help, since he had saved her from harm. The young man asked if she remembered what happened before the kidnapping and whether anyone had helped the bandits lure her. Embarrassed, she turned away and said she had not been kidnapped, but had been cruelly deceived, and someone had taken advantage of her trust. Smiling, she said she was an artist whose work had never been popular. Because the pieces did not sell, she had to make a living by displaying them at the market. One day, a masked robber approached her and said he had a job for her, and all she had to do was go with him. The girl immediately sensed something was wrong, and when she stepped into a dark alley, he said the terrifying words that he planned to sell her. After that, she remembered nothing. After hearing her story, Jade smiled and said that being an artist is interesting, then asked what she did. The girl reached into her bag and said she always carries her tools. She took out a hammer and other tools, saying she was a sculptor who could make good statues, and Jade was a little surprised. Then he asked if she would work with him, even though someone had recently tried to sell her. The girl was stunned by the proposal and asked again what he meant. The boy awkwardly scratched the back of his head, apologized, and said he'd just gotten too excited and hadn't expressed himself clearly. Jade told her he was a novice adventurer and needed to collect various items to level up. After hearing him, the girl brightened when she learned she could make magical tools from her sculptures, and she turned away awkwardly, murmuring that it was fascinating. Jade smiled and said it was okay and that he understood her reaction. He added he could learn magical skills by drawing circles in the air. The girl was even more surprised and called it a wonderful ability. Lowering her head, she thanked him sadly for his support and said she didn't even know she could do that. It was about making magical tools, since that required a sculpture. With her hands folded on her knees, the girl admitted she was not a great professional, so her tools might not be of high quality. Jade silently disagreed with her and said out loud that that's exactly why he wants to ask her for help. He explained that the magical tools he needed could be made by hand. The girl looked surprised and asked him to repeat, so Jade decided to explain everything in more detail. The boy said that when a mage makes tools by hand from precious materials, the tools become more powerful because they are filled with living energy, so the sculpture will be very useful. Lowering her head, the girl thought about what she had heard and then said she could probably try to help him. Jade jumped up happily and asked whether that was really true. She said it was her way of thanking him for saving her life. Clenching her fists, the girl said she would definitely help her rescuer and asked for permission to work beside him. Jade was excited and agreed. He reached out and gave his name. The girl smiled, offered her hand, and said her name was Gina. They shook hands. Remembering something, Jade opened the storage, saying it was time to tally the results, and began placing the bandits' bodies inside to see how much his level had risen. Gina instantly realized it was the same storage magic he had mentioned earlier and asked if it was really possible. Jade scratched his head and apologized for the delay. After putting the bandit, wrapped in a bandage, and the burly thug into the storeroom, the boy paused and noticed something odd. Turning to Gina, he said he needed help. The young man asked her to carve specific symbols into a magical item. She said she could try, and he began to explain. After drawing a sample of the symbol on paper, Jade showed it and said, "This is the exact one to carve into the stone." He warned that the main things are the proportions and precise placement. After hearing him, Gina suddenly pulled a full set of tools from her bag and said eagerly that she would do everything properly. Jade sighed in surprise at seeing so many tools. She placed a small table in front of her, fixed a magic stone on it, and began to work. Jade watched her closely, sitting nearby with a satisfied look. Soon, Gina turned, smiling, and said everything was ready. Jade was impressed, since only 3 minutes had passed and the work was already flawless. Jade picked up the carved magic stone and, studying it, could not hide his admiration. The workmanship was perfect, a true jeweler's masterpiece, and he could not understand why no one bought Gina's pieces. After thanking the girl, he sat beside the bandit and told Gina to step back because he would try to activate magic and it could be dangerous. Gina stepped back obediently, and Jade only hoped it would work. Rolling back the robber's clothing, the boy pulled out a dagger. He could not explain to Ginny why he did it because he did not know if it would work. He had no choice but to try. Grunting and frowning, Jade began carving a deep cut across the bandit's chest with his blade. Convinced the cut had to be at heart level for the stone to work, he clenched his teeth and silently told it to act, and finally the wound began to close. One way to get SP was to cast a curse and destroy evil, and the pentagram stone Gina made helped Jade do that. So he used the curse of reversal. The bandits taken alive could be handed over to the guild and convicted, but those who trafficked people might belong to a higher organization. Magical tools were made so someone could question bandits in person and learn all the details. After finishing the job, Jade wiped his brow and exhaled in relief. Thanks to Gina, he managed to finish what he'd planned. Turning back, he thanked her and said he could not have done it without her, and Gina replied that she was glad to help. Turning around, Jade said it was time to head to the guild, but asked Gina first to help him hunt slimes, and she agreed at once, saying she could do it easily. At the guild, Jade was filling out papers when Ramon walked by carrying a large barrel, asked in surprise what the boy was doing there, and when he saw him, Jade said happily, "The young man said he bought gear today and completed the task." The man asked how much he had earned. Jade replied awkwardly that he didn't remember exactly, but it was about 400 million. Ramon dropped the barrel in shock when he heard that. Ramon asked how Jade had managed to get such a huge sum. The boy calmly replied that he had done nothing special. Curling his fingers, he counted off that he had beaten a shadow fighter and a snake, and had sold a phantom core for 3 million. When Ramon heard about the phantom core, he gaped. The thought that this young man had beaten the phantom shook him. Jade offered an awkward smile and said it had just happened that way. Ramon snapped that rumors said getting the core was harder than killing a dragon and complained about his indifference. Lifting the barrel from the floor, he said the story had shaken him to the core, and hunched over, Ramon shuffled away, muttering that Jade had earned 400 million, as if with a snap of his fingers. Gina, standing nearby, heard their conversation and quietly asked Jade how many months it had taken him to sell everything he'd earned during the tasks. The man was surprised by the question and said he did it all in one day. Gina was stunned because he earned an incredible 400 million gold coins that same day. She muttered that it wasn't even a tenth of her monthly salary, since she was always in debt. Jade scratched the back of his neck, feeling awkward in front of Gina. A young woman approached them holding papers, apologized for the delay, and said the study of the bandits' magical gear was finally complete. Pointing to the side, she asked Jade and Jin to follow her, serious and responsible about her work. She led them to the table where the robbers' belongings lay and explained that most had been stolen. If they recognized their items, they could take them. Seeing something familiar, Gina sighed. She rushed to the table, grabbed the hat, and said happily that it was hers. Jade was pleased too, and said it was good they had found it. And when the girl put the hat on, she smiled because she liked it very much. The woman with the report leaned over the map and pointed to where the bandits were found. Jade told her there had been 3 of them, and one cast a spell to get away. Jade closed her eyes, activated the search, and tried to locate the fugitive, but found nothing and assumed he was still unconscious. The woman with the papers said he would handle this matter perfectly. Jade asked, puzzled, if she was really certain. She replied that she hadn't thought of anyone else but him. Excitedly, she said Ramon had told her yesterday about his successes since the young man defeated the Earthshaker with a single move. Jade looked embarrassed and scratched the back of his neck. A woman officially asked Jade to find the escaped bandit, track him down and eliminate him, stating she was assigning the mission on behalf of the guild. She explained the reward would depend on how quickly the criminal was caught and on his rank, so Jade had to catch him as soon as possible. The young man smiled and thanked her for her trust. At the Jade Hotel, he rented a room for Gina and 2 extra rooms for meetings and work. Entering her room, he asked whether she really wanted to take on the case today. While getting ready for work, she replied confidently and told him not to worry because everything would be ready in 3 hours. Jade thought 66,000 for 3 hours was a huge sum, and Gina was doing a great job. The young man spread 2 sheets on the table, one with a sketch of a magic slime stone and the other with a sketch of an eagle stone. Gina looked closely, said she understood, and sat down to work, while Jade smiled as he watched her. Approaching the door, he heard Gina call him. Turning, he asked what had happened. Smiling sincerely, the girl thanked Jade from the bottom of her heart for everything he had done and said she was incredibly grateful to him. Jade smiled at her and quietly closed the door. Fatigue was finally catching up with him, and his first day as an adventurer was coming to an end. The next time, he knocked on the room's wooden door and waited to be let in. When no one answered, Jade paused briefly, then carefully opened the door and looked inside. Stepping into the room, he froze at the sight and stood with his mouth open in surprise. On the bed, Gina slept peacefully, softly snoring. He stepped closer and stood by the headboard, watching her. A smile never left her face. She must have been dreaming of something nice. Jade smiled gently and thought she had been so exhausted from work that she fell asleep during it. 2 boxes of magical tools that Gina had made at his request sat on the table. Jade picked them up and confirmed they were identical. Taking his tools, he placed a small pouch of money on the table. Not wanting to wake her because she was too tired, he left the reward there. Jade stepped out onto the street in high spirits, smiling as she thought she could raise her SP today thanks to the new magical tools Gina had made. He counted 66 standard tools and one special tool for a wider range of actions against powerful enemies. Called Threat Zone, the tool was rarely used in attacks because novices were banned from it, since it was too rare and practically irreplaceable. If someone can control such a tool, they can easily summon phantoms and increase their SP. Jade stopped abruptly, shuddering at the thought of the various tools and realizing with horror that he had made a serious mistake taking on another task involving them. A young man fell to his knees and pounded the ground with his fists. He sighed heavily, bitterly realizing he would not get the magic stone today because of his own mistake. Now calm, Jade went into the forest to look for magical creatures, and as he looked around, he was surprised to see a pool reflecting the sunlight. Moving closer, he saw it was a lake. Jade decided this was where he would find magical creatures to test his new tools and complete the task. Waves rose from the lake's smooth surface, and he went on alert. Jade realized something was wrong. A loud splash sent water several meters up, hitting the bird flying over the lake. It was a divine arrow that pierced the bird's body. She slipped under the water, dragging her prey behind her. Jade smirked and summoned a magical weapon to fight her, unaware he would encounter such a monster here. Bracing himself, the young man activated the device and charged. In a moment, he destroyed the divine arrow, and the creature's corpse bobbed to the surface. Jade thought he was incredibly lucky. Pulling both the bird and the creature onto the shore, he smiled with satisfaction. Setting the bird aside, the boy crouched over the monster and pulled out a knife. Knowing the shaft of the divine arrow had to be made first, he set to work on the blade with practiced skill. After finishing the processing, Jade lifted the creature and studied it closely. It occurred to him that with proper handling, the divine arrow could become a weapon. He suddenly tensed and turned his head away sharply. The boy stood up at once and turned toward where he sensed another monster. He opened the status menu and ordered the divine arrow to transform into a weapon. The monster's body turned into a curved sickle blade. Jade smiled, knowing this was the moment to test it. Striding decisively toward the ape-like monster that was unaware, he left a trail of dust behind him. Peering at the creature, the young man realized it was a shadow monster he had never encountered before. Jade squinted, focused, and prepared to fight. He took a proper stance, gripped the sickle blade firmly with both hands, and swung sharply, preparing to strike. When he activated the crescent blade's magic, a powerful wave smashed the nearby trees and split the rocks, scattering debris in all directions. An ape-like monster noticed Jade's attack and lunged straight at him. But before it could get close, a magic wave sliced its body into pieces. Jade looked around and saw the destruction. Dozens of fallen trees, scattered rocks, and an entire stretch of forest flattened by a single blow. The young man looked at the weapon, stunned that he had known it was sharp, but had not expected such destructive power, and he smiled with awe, finding it astonishing. Jade continued to think that the scythe blade had a unique ability to create shock waves of incredible force that could destroy anything in their path. Examining the blade, he concluded that the divine arrow's power had greatly strengthened his magic, granting the blade unprecedented strength. Swaying the weapon that seemed as flexible as jelly, he thought it only made the blast waves stronger, and that worked in his favor. Jade was sure the blade had become a truly powerful weapon, and he would keep using it and later forge the material into a real sword. Opening the portal, he sent the monkey's body inside to avoid hauling it himself. After returning, he intended to find a skilled blacksmith in the guild. Jade picked up the magic stone and decided to try engraving a pentagram on it to extend its powers indefinitely. He sat on the ground, drew his sword, and started carving symbols, and Jade figured she could not go back to the city to ask Jin, so she had to do it herself without damaging the stone. Looking at the tiny stone, he felt annoyed that Gina would do much better and was uncomfortable working with something so small and slippery. He put the stone on the ground, finished his work, and touched the pentagram. Jade thought the symbol looked fine and said out loud that everything was ready. He quickly stepped away from the stone and decided it was time to test its power. The farther he moved, the more keenly he felt that the moment of the test had come. Pushing off a huge boulder, he leapt onto a tree branch. A tired exhale escaped him after 10 minutes of running. Jade realized his job now was to destroy all the monsters drawn to the stone. He looked at the monsters surrounding the stone. They came in different sizes and forms, but all had been drawn by the pentagram's power. Swarms of giant bees drew his attention most, settling on the stone and forming a humming sphere around it that made the pentagram barely visible. He also spotted monstrous boars and even werewolves, figuring that together they would add up to a sizable number of enemies. Picking up another stone, he realized with excitement that adding the monsters underground and in the sky would push his score above 100. That was his signal to attack. Jade clenched the stone in her hand, pressed the magic sigil, and loudly announced the activation. The stone trembled and began sending out powerful waves of energy. He flung it into the crowd of monsters, watching its path closely to make sure everything went according to plan. The beasts lifted their heads and fixated on the stone, and at that moment, a blinding light filled everything around them. Waves of magic burst from the stone and swept over the monsters. Shaking harder, the stone began to break apart under the pressure of its own power. A blast rang out, and it finally crumbled, its magic gone. Jade watched the clearing closely. The monsters were still running, but he smiled and called out loudly that it was enough, proud that he had done well. Opening the map, Jade looked at the black dot that marked him and counted the nearby white dots showing monsters. There were only 61. He instantly jumped down from the branch. After landing, he touched the ground with his hand and shouted with joy that it was time to begin. Fully prepared, the boy was ready to fight every monster. Werewolves immediately lunged at him. Jade closed his eyes behind a strand of hair, said he would use the hinge attack, and activated a magic screen for the strike. Hundreds of magical stones rose and lined up in neat rows, and the werewolves froze, watching Jade stand before them, determined to destroy each of them. The monsters cried out in pain as the stones activated, their howls spreading around, while the wolves tried in vain to break free and could not take a step. A cloud of dust rose into the air, and when it settled, the monster was gone. Jade reached out, smiling, and said he was grateful to them for what he called a tasty meal. Opening the character screen, he smiled and read that 61 phantoms had been destroyed. SP was 18,300, and he now had 139 skill points. His physical strength and magic had increased by 17. Then he opened the storage and pulled out a sack. Dropping to one knee, the boy clenched the sack, swung his arm sharply, and threw it forward. It suddenly turned into dozens of sharp daggers, and Jade loudly ordered them to fly. Blades tore through the trees, and the boy watched in shock as the trunk split into 3 pieces and crashed down. And he hadn't expected that, and was taken aback by the effortless, destructive power. Clenching his fist and smiling at it, Jade thought with admiration that he could now defeat even a boar monster, and was pleased with the result. Opening the character screen, he carefully reread the data. His class, novice, XP 222, time 220 seconds, MP 128, and 1420 skill points. He paused to decide where to spend the remaining SP. Jade kept thinking there was a good reason he had put over 10 points into physical strength and magic. The screen asked if he was sure, and the boy pressed yes. Covering half his face with a lock of hair, he hid his eyes. A moment later, a new ability, the XI, awakened and made him smile. Jade realized the IX allowed him to see everything inside a living body, from muscle movement to organ health, and instantly spot any creature's weak points. The map showed a much larger area, so he realized he could now track the target's movements, making the skill much more useful. Looking at the trees, he said aloud that it was time to begin the search. Jade wanted to test his strength one more time before leaving, and he suddenly noticed something. Sidestepping, the young man avoided a boar lurking nearby. He smiled, thinking he had found exactly what he needed. The monster opened its jaws threateningly and roared. Jade shouted to summon the IX and rushed toward the enemy, his eye lighting up with an X mark showing the skill was active. A wave of nervousness hit him as he realized he now had all the information for his next moves and had to study it carefully. With a magical gaze, he examined the monster and decided how to act next. Jade leaned back quickly and shifted his weight onto his left leg for exactly half a second, then stepped aside and now stood directly in front of the boar. The surprised monster tried to follow his movements, but Jade happily realized it had lost its balance, giving him a chance to attack. Surging forward, he spotted a weak point on the boar's leg thanks to the XI, and Jade thought excitedly that this was exactly where to strike. He hit the monster's leg with all his strength and heard its piercing cry. The boar opened its mouth, revealing huge tusks. He tried to move forward, but his injured leg twisted, exactly as Jade wanted. Then he spotted another weak spot and braced for the next strike. The boar collapsed to the ground, its will to fight gone. Jade opened his inventory and pulled out a special fish, expecting it to deliver a devastating blow that would leave the beast unable to move. Carefully studying the body, he analyzed it again and found the exact spot to strike. Shouting that he would use the moonblade, he lunged forward. At that moment, the boar's head flew off its body. Jade carried out the action as cleanly and safely as possible, his skill letting him defeat the opponent with ease. He landed and looked at the dead body and the deep crack his strike left in the ground. Jade realized he had overdone his power a little. Realizing he'd attempted to combine two techniques at once, a satisfied smile crossed his face because it had worked perfectly. Drawing his dagger, he approached the body and began to pull out the magic stone. Activating the search skill, a message informed him that 5 more skill points had been added. Returning to the guild, he showed his prize to Sylvia. Sylvia smiled and said he had done an excellent job again. Jade agreed and added that she had never seen anyone kill so cleanly, only a nick on the gem. Jade scratched his head awkwardly and said it was the skill that locks onto a target. Smiling, he wondered if she would understand him. Sylvia just sighed and said he was talking in his strange way again. She gave him a stern look and warned him not to bring a phantom core this time. Jade flinched in surprise. He spread his hands and mumbled awkwardly that she was making it up, that he'd just been lucky last time and didn't want to worry her again. Jade remembered the girl's stunned first reaction and decided he would never do anything like that again. Once was enough. The boy pulled out a sharp fish and excitedly called Sylvia over to look at his find. Sylvia, stunned, said it was exactly what she had been thinking. Leaning over the fish, the girl examined it closely and, amazed, suggested it might be a divine arrow. and Jade replied, stunned, that it was incredible. Straightening up and adjusting her glasses, Sylvia explained that it was not as good as a phantom, but even a find like this was rare, and Jade said happily that it was more than enough because he dreamed of turning it into a weapon. Sylvia listened intently to his words, and Jade asked, curious, if she knew anyone nearby who could help, since it was very important to him. The girl looked away and went quiet, a little annoyed, then sighed and said wearily that she knew a craftsman and could recommend him. Jade reached the Vogue forge, which looked well kept, with logs stacked in neat towers, everything clean and orderly, and the building gave a pleasant impression. He watched the forge closely, convinced the answer had to be here. Sylvia said the smith was indeed skilled, but there was one problem. Jade asked what it was and felt a sudden unease. As he stepped inside, the boy saw a man and politely apologized for intruding. Sylvia warned that the blacksmith had a terrible temper. Working, a man heard a stranger's voice, jerked his head up, and fixed him with a sharp, attentive stare. Jade, feeling awkward after Sylvia's words, pulled out the fish and said in a trembling voice that he wanted to make it into a sword. The blacksmith stepped closer, stunned, said it was a divine arrow, wondered how the young man had managed to get it, and added that it was sheer luck. Jade felt relieved that he was not aggressive, smiled, and asked them to take his order, promising to be deeply grateful. The man smiled self-satisfied and said loudly that he would take the job, since only he could handle such material. His voice rang with confident pride. Jade wiped sweat from her brow with a towel and, offering a hurried thank you, was relieved that everything was going so well. The young man smiled to himself, curious why the blacksmith spoke so proudly, and thought the man might have been pleased by a rare find that put him in a good mood. Jade asked impatiently when he could pick up the finished sword, eager to see it, and the blacksmith unexpectedly asked if he could pay right away. The boy went pale with surprise, sweat on his forehead, completely baffled by what the master meant and why he had to pay now. Flustered and waving his hands, Jade tried to explain that he should be paid, not the blacksmith. His words jumbled, and he nearly shouted as he tried to make his meaning clear. The man looked at him intently, as if trying to make sense of it. Then he inhaled sharply, suddenly realizing something, and it dawned on him. Gloating at the boy, the blacksmith asked irritably if he really planned to use the sword himself, and sneered that the idea sounded ridiculous. He shouted even louder that he'd never give such a weapon to a kid, and Jade, shocked, shot back that he had meant something completely different. Koval banged his fist and announced he would forge the sword himself and either keep it or sell it to someone truly worthy. He had no intention of giving the weapon to Jade. The man threw a heavy bag onto the table and said sharply that this was exactly what he meant, that the boy could leave, but the sword would stay. Jade froze at those words, unable to move. Anger boiled inside him. He thought the blacksmith a terrible man and could not believe the blacksmith would say that. The master took his fish and said that if Jade himself used the material, the sword would weep. The boy felt himself breaking inside at those words. Koval looked him in the eye once more and asked sternly if he had understood everything correctly, hoping the boy would finally realize his place. Jade clenched his fist and thought angrily that those words were complete nonsense. He had gathered the material himself and had the right to it, so it was unfair even if others disagreed. With a strand of hair shading his eyes, the boy demanded to know whether he would only receive the sword by proving his strength. Jade could not accept his prize being handed to someone else. Koval asked, in surprise, what he meant, and Jade replied confidently that he only wanted a chance to prove his abilities because he did not want Koval to misjudge his character. The man asked in surprise if Jade was really confident, and the young man thrilled to finally have a chance to show his skills, smiled, and said yes, of course. Koval said firmly that Jade would then fight whoever Jade chose, and added he would not force him, even if he was wounded in the process. The boy was sure he could handle anything, since there was no other choice and he had to get the sword. Jade said out loud that she was not even afraid of being wounded. The blacksmith turned away, thinking, then briefly ordered the boy to come here in exactly 7 days. Jade said he understood. Smiling as he walked home, Jade thought the blacksmith had seen only a child in him, but being called weak stung, and he vowed to prove otherwise. Back home, Jade opened a portal, and magic stones taken in battle began pouring out. There was a whole mountain of them because he had defeated countless monsters. The table was piled high with sparkling stones, and Gina said in surprise that there were so many. Jade, wiping sweat from her brow, answered awkwardly that it had taken some effort. He turned to the young woman and sincerely apologized for the urgent request, asking whether she could manage the work by tomorrow. While inside, he worried it might be too much for her. Gina said proudly that everyone could rely on her because she could finish it in one night. Jade asked in surprise whether she could really do it. He said happily that he was very grateful to her, but asked her not to push herself too hard. Gina replied confidently that he had nothing to worry about. The next day, Jade went to hunt phantoms in dangerous places and did it 3 times a day without stopping for 3 days straight. He climbed a tall mountain where a lone tree stood, realized only 4 days remained until the battle, and his SP had risen a lot and felt his training was enough. Jade decided to boost his stats and, opening the screen, immediately added 47 points to strength and magic, feeling his body fill with new power. He placed his palm on the trunk, tapped it lightly a few times, then suddenly struck it with full force to test the result. A powerful blow split the tree with a crack, and it crashed to the ground. Jade picked up a piece, tossed it, and made sure everything was going as planned. Brushing off his clothes and smiling, he thought it was wonderful. Filled with pleasure, Jade grew increasingly sure of his coming victory and that the sword would be his. He thought it best to avoid encounters with dragon-level monsters or a giant octopus, and meanwhile raised his defense by adding 15 points to the barrier. With his hand outstretched, he shouted the spell, and a diamond-shaped shield formed in front of him, so large it blocked the sun. Jade tapped the barrier and thought it was mostly defensive magic, but it could be used in a very different way, and he could picture exactly how. Kicking the shield, he was surprised to find it unharmed. Jade decided the points he had were enough to make him powerful. While coming down the mountain, he accidentally hit a tree and split it in two, and he jumped up, though not very high. Then the boy shouted the spell again and made a shield under his feet that let him push off and spring up even higher. Soaring much higher than before, he enjoyed the view and thought this way of using the skill opened new possibilities. Grinning widely, he said it was incredible that they could now even fight in midair, and Jade was thrilled by the power he had gained. He jumped onto the barrier again, pushed off, and rose up with a joyful shout. As he landed, a cloud of dust burst up beneath his feet. Jade smiled and said happily that everything was going well, then decided to upgrade X-Sight to level 10 to make it as useful as possible. With his vision improved, he could see much better, and as he looked ahead, he laughed with delight because nothing could hide from him now, and the whole area lay open before him. Meanwhile, a nearby monkey monster twitched its ears at the strange sounds. It snapped its head around and saw Jade racing straight toward it. The monkey swung its arms into a fighting stance, ready for battle, but Jade suddenly darted past and threw it off as he ran around the creature to the other side. Seizing the beast by its long tail, Jade shouted that he had activated IX. His eye flashed with bright light, and an X appeared in his pupil, the symbol of awakened power. Using the star X, the boy scanned the surroundings, his eyes sweeping over ridges and rough ground until he spotted a tall mountain with a thin, sharp peak, and felt glad he had finally found what he needed. Jade immediately calculated the right trajectory for his plan and hurled the monkey with all his strength toward the chosen spot. He already knew exactly what would happen next, and his heart filled with anticipation. The monkey barely turned its head and saw the cliff's sharp edge before its body crashed into it at a terrible speed, leaving no chance to avoid the impact. The impact was so powerful that the rock split and shattered, scattering stones in all directions, and Jade froze in a throwing pose, watching closely as the scene unfolded. The young man figured that by using the terrain and its features correctly, he could calculate the trajectory precisely and deliver a devastating blow that would instantly put the enemy out of the fight. Jade kept thinking that although his own strength would have been enough this time, it would be unwise to rely only on it without using such a skill. Jade opened the screen and pressed yes. Smiling, he said he'd just gained the warrior's protection skill, and now he had another powerful trump card. The young man thought about the power hidden in this skill. If he is right, the stored energy can turn into the strongest protective dome that repels any attack and activates at a decisive moment, but it can only be used in certain situations. He pictured hellfire spewing from the dragon's jaws and an impenetrable dome rising around him that stopped any flame from touching his body. The thought inspired him. Jade kept thinking that because the skill uses no mana, its power exceeds that of 5 creatures, and he even pictured himself attacking a dragon and forcing it to defend. The skill required 10,000 points, but it would let him significantly raise his power by strengthening the dome. It can be upgraded again and again if his level is above average. It's convenient, but needs caution, and Jade was eager to try everything right away. Soon, a new opponent appeared on the path. Jade was pleased to realize he had encountered a giant boar, a perfect chance to test his new skill in real combat. Calling out to activate X vision, the boy felt his eye flare with light, and an X appeared in his pupil, a clear sign the skill had activated. He focused on the monster trudging toward him. Jade tensed, thinking it guarded its territory and would fight to the last breath. The boy stood still, watching the beast approach. Tension rose when the boar's snout stopped only a meter from his face. Suddenly, the monster lunged forward at breakneck speed, knocking Jade aside. The boy cried out in pain, but felt a thrill inside, because this was exactly what he wanted and everything was going according to plan. His body flew aside, but thanks to Jade's skill, he could see a map of moves showing his next step, and he watched the boar's movements closely. With his hand on the ground at the right spot, the boy smoothly balanced on one hand and did exactly as his subconscious guided him. Jade sprang up, stepped a few meters to the side, and froze, staring at the monster. His skill showed the distance between them was exactly 7 meters. He looked at the magical item and loudly announced the activation of Warrior's Protection. Jade thought excitedly that he now had a 100% chance to succeed in his plan. He realized this power let him attack even from a distance. A normal monster would cross in an instant. The farther the distance, the stronger the skill. Despite his confidence, the young man acknowledged that defeat was still possible. Though the chance was small, he could not ignore the danger and had to stay alert. A strong gust rose unexpectedly. Jade glanced at the stats. XP, 51,616 of 52,064. MP, 390 of 390. The boar panted, its fury clear, and the boy decided it was time to act. With a fierce smile, Jade called out, "Warrior's Shield," and simultaneously activated X-Vision. His eyes burned with resolve as he prepared to fight. Suddenly, he snapped his head around and felt something odd. After using an expanded search, he stopped, surprised to realize it might be what he had suspected. In an instant, Jade struck the boar on the head with all his strength. The monster let out a deafening roar, flew into the air and crashed to the ground, and the boy moved on, curious about the new sensation. He stopped and realized that, unfortunately, the power had been too strong for him, which is why everything ended that way. A cloud of smoke rose in front of him. Smoke cleared, revealing the outline of an unknown monster. Jade saw strange horns and huge blade-sharp teeth that could tear anyone apart. When the curtain vanished, a creature stood before him, a four-armed devil dragon with terrible claws that made his blood run cold. Jade, drenched in sweat and trembling with excitement, asked himself how this could be possible, since he had not expected to meet a devil dragon here, and it all felt unreal. Looking into the dragon's twisted maw, Jade realized he was facing a creature born from a terrible mutation that mixed ancient dragon blood with other beasts, and it was a true monster. The massive paws caught his attention, and he realized the creature before him was not a natural beast, but an artificial demon engineered by highly intelligent beings in a hidden laboratory. His imagination painted a grim picture of a clawed paw taking a test tube of murky liquid and mixing it with another, creating a savage new life that now stood before him as this dragon. The monster opened its mouth, and an eye glowed ominously inside. Jade immediately remembered that such creatures were called defective dragons because they had limited magical power and bore a cursed divine seal. With his special skill activated, he looked at the map and realized the dragon could not fully display its magical power on the surface, which gave him at least some advantage. Jade moved closer to the monster and, staring into its single eye, realized its power changed with each enemy. So he decided to trigger an earthquake to stop the dragon from dragging everything underground, then loudly announced the activation of Scythe. Sneering, he declared that Warrior's Shield was at full power. Jade knew he had to stop the monster by any means, and he would. It still wasn't enough. Activating an aura boost, he could attack while the protective dome held. Magic flowed through him, stirring excitement and impatience. He scowled, furious at his own hesitation. Summoning all his strength, Jade struck the monster squarely in the teeth, his fist smashing the front fangs into shards, and the boy felt he had truly used all his power this time. The dragon roared fiercely, glaring at him with its single eye, then began wildly swinging its arms, consumed by rage over the insult. His paw slammed down with a thunderous crash, but Jade thrust her hand forward and caught the blow. The force cracked rocks and shattered stone boulders into pieces. With X-Sight, he studied the dragon's body closely and finally found a weak spot. His gaze hardened, and he knew exactly how to break the beast. Filled with rage, Jade fired at the weak spot. The strike shattered the dragon's paw, tearing it from its body, and the monster collapsed to the ground. The youth, breathing hard, recovered some of his lost mana. The dragon glared at him with one eye. Jade realized that even with a wounded paw, the creature remained incredibly strong and threatening. The young man realized that to beat such an enemy, he had to give it his all and was ready to fight to the end, even to break himself to win. Suddenly, the dragon opened its mouth even wider and began forming a black magical sphere that gave off a deadly aura. Jade tensed, preparing for the decisive trial. He recognized it as heteromorphic breath, a distinct form of magical attack that hits an enemy precisely. It was one of the most dangerous skills in existence. Jade figured an energy blast like that could throw him back kilometers and even destroy the dome, but he has a hidden ace that will save the situation. He formed a magical barrier and shouted the spell, Eclipse. In response, the dragon fired a black beam, trying to kill its opponent with it. The beam swelled and hurtled forward at incredible speed, slamming into the barrier. Watching it, the dragon was sure no one could overcome that power. Jade was determined not to let the monster win. Reaching forward, he called forth a magic sphere to finish the fight once and for all. The boy created a series of protective shields, and the beam began to bounce off them. The first barrier could not hold and exploded, breaking into shards that vanished into the air. The exhausted dragon stopped its attack and breathed heavily, lowering its head. The ground was covered in craters and cracks from the force of its beam. Jade held the last shield, already covered in cracks. He lowered his hand and stared at the monster. The dragon trembled in fear as the boy called loudly to summon the sphere. A magical beam burst out, hit the cliff, and grew stronger. The dragon watched in shock, unable to understand how the young man could use the power like that. Jade swept his hand in fury. He jumped up and struck the dragon squarely in the chest. The blow was so powerful, the monster could not withstand it and collapsed onto its back. Jade raised his hand and uttered the call of darkness. Grabbing the dragon's paw, he hurled the creature's body into the sky with all his strength and watched it fly to make sure the monster could not rise. Assuming a fighting stance, Jade knew it was finally time to activate his sword, and with a fierce shout, he invoked Flame Blade. He jumped onto the barrier he had made, pushed off it, and shot upward, reaching the dragon. Anger burned in his chest, and he would not let the monster escape after everything. The devil dragon stared in fear at the human who brazenly used those techniques and panicked, flailing its arms as it tried to protect itself from the relentless magic. Blades tore into the dragon, cutting through it, and with no strength left, it only accepted its fate. Through the dust, its severed legs and the broken arm that Jade had smashed earlier were visible. He built barrier after barrier, vaulting them until he reached the highest point, where he could see every detail of the wounded monster's body. Directly above the dragon's head, Jade struck with incredible force, hitting its belly where bloody marks from magical blades glowed, and the monster collapsed. A massive body crashed down, ripping up the ground along with rocks and hills. Jade landed on a hill and watched coldly as the defeated dragon died. A huge hole from his blow appeared in the creature's body. All the monster's life force drained away, and it had been defeated by a human who beat it so easily. Jade realized he was not as simple as he had seemed, so he returned to his old hairstyle, covered the X-marked eye, and looked the same as before. He thought he had used substitution magic successfully, but the mission almost failed. The dragon was too strong, and his power barely made a difference. Yet in the end, it fell to a single, precise strike. Jade jumped off the cliff and figured that defeating the divine dragon would still grant points, raising the level and adding 200 SP. It might not be much, but it matters for rank. He stepped up to the body and loudly ordered the storage compartment opened. A screen flashed in front of him, and Jade began scanning the body, figuring out the best way to handle the loot. What's done is done, he decided, opening the panel and spending points to upgrade the storage to level 10 because it made his life easier. He shoved the dragon into the storage and made sure its huge body fit completely. Jade thought he would leave it there for now because not much could happen. Returning home, the boy wondered what Sylvia would say when he told her about the battle. Scratching his head, He sighed awkwardly and decided it was time to go back. 3 days had passed. Jade sat on his bed, opened the screen, and carefully read the information about himself, especially the updated data. He checked his stats. XP, 52,664 of 52 saw, MP 49,490, skill points 142,000. Jade thought he could still raise his rank. Pressing a few buttons, he hoped no major problems would arise. The storage was expanded to 100 slots. He thought aloud that Spellbreaker is a technique that can block any hostile magic, so it's a very handy tool. He wanted to test whether she could suppress the power of the divine arrow. By adding the half-moon blade, he could withstand any powerful spell. Pulling on the black cloak, he realized he would have to train harder and master a new skill code, and his rank was already high, so the risk of loss was minimal. Jade decided to use magic techniques as often as possible. By restoring his energy and going all out, he would become truly unbeatable. With a broad smile, he was pleased that everything was going as planned. Impatient, he wanted to test his new powers as soon as possible. First, he headed into the mountains, then returned to the smithy where the master blacksmith was to work, and opened the door that creaked unpleasantly. Inside, he saw a blacksmith holding a cup of coffee, and beside him, a tall man with a massive sword at his belt, who looked at Jade in surprise. Koval said anxiously that the meeting had come. He had not expected the young man to show up, and asked nervously why he needed it. Jade paused for a few seconds, then said calmly that he planned to practice and asked if the master knew a place for it. The smith squinted in surprise. He turned and shouted that a small field lay behind the shop, and told him to follow so he could show where to test their strength. Jade smiled broadly and said he understood. It pleased him that the blacksmith had not turned him away and had even decided to help. Jade, the blacksmith, and the stranger left the forge and headed into the forest, and the blacksmith carried a wrapped object that looked like a sword. They walked in silence for a long time, the rustle of autumn leaves their only companion. Jade walked behind, watching both men closely. He leaned toward the blacksmith and asked hesitantly if he would have to fight that stranger, and the master only grunted in reply. Verge asked what he meant. Jade answered awkwardly that she simply felt a special energy from him and thought he had a divine arrow. The blacksmith grumbled that he'd finish the job in no time, since he was dealing with the highest-ranking adventurer, and hoped the man would not let him down, while Jade grimly thought they were speaking so loudly on purpose as if to his face. He reminded himself that though a newcomer beside that man, the key was to trust his own strength and skill, regardless of the opponent's rank or title. Jade was surprised his opponent had sensed his abilities and even picked up the arrow energy, which showed he was facing a truly strong opponent worthy of attention. Watching Verga's back and the warrior ahead, he decided this voix was clearly aiming for B rank, so they were nearly equal, though the similarity still made him uneasy. Jade realized that even if their ranks were equal, the difference in technique was still huge, so in a duel they would fight differently, and he would have to deal with strikes of different range and force. He admitted it was hard to judge such an opponent's abilities, but he felt his level matched B rank, so he still had a chance to win. Jade thought angrily that he had to focus on his strength. Retreat was not an option, because defeat now would mean losing everything he had fought for. They stopped in front of an old building with no roof, and Verge said loudly that this was their spot where they could train and fight as often as they wanted. Voice tilted his head and said Verge had not warned them. It was a whole arena. Jade also looked it over carefully, but stayed silent, lost in thought. Inside, Verge loudly announced that the place is passed down through generations. Sometimes he lets young adventurers train and compete here. Verge pulled wooden swords from a canvas bag. This was not what Jade had expected. Verge ordered that they practice strikes with these blades. Jade picked up the sword, examined it closely, checked its weight, tested its balance in his hands, and muttered as he judged its quality. Voice grimaced and called to him in a mocking tone, forcing him to pay attention. Jade snapped out of her thoughts and asked sharply what that meant. Voice smiled and told him to look closer. Voice shouted something incomprehensible and laughed wildly, saying he was summoning the moon's magic, and Jade watched warily as he seemed almost mad in that moment. Verge clenched his fist and let out a joyful shout because this was exactly what he had been waiting for. He wanted to see that move and clearly wanted Voir to win. Voice swung his sword and told Jade plainly that everything was clear now, gripping the blade as he added arrogantly that a true B-rank fighter was strong enough for a fight like this. He shook his sword, taunting that he would back down so Jade would not be harmed. It was the last chance to get out of here, because beyond this point, there would be no way back. Jade seethed with rage, furious that Voir openly treated him like a weakling. Outraged, he thought this upstart had won a promotion he did not deserve and was now brazenly demanding that he step aside, but he would not back down. Voir asked mockingly if he had swallowed his tongue. Confidently, Jade resolved to prove he deserved the rank he earned by his own efforts and will use simple spells to put the arrogant, self-absorbed man in his place so everyone will see. He opened the screen and checked his stats. His physical condition rose by 4, but moon magic was still a bit unstable. He remembered the wolves' howls and thought someone should put that braggart in his place during the battle because he clearly overestimates himself. Jade saw his opponent's smug smile and admitted the opponent's edge was sword skill and a strong body. But that wasn't enough because it was time for a fair fight. He declared loudly he would not back down and that his opponent should not expect otherwise, while Voir cried out in shock and then hissed angrily that the other would regret his choice. He said with hatred that he'd already given him a chance, but it was too late now. They stood face to face, and Verge said sternly that there had been enough talk and it was time to prepare. Voice twisted his face and called out to Jade with a mocking greeting. Jade just gave a contemptuous look because he disliked his opponent's behavior. Verge raised his voice to announce the start. Voice swung his sword and shouted that he would grind Jade to powder. He had no doubt he would win. Verge also swung his sword and loudly shouted the call of the Moonblade. Jade saw the magical blade and coldly reached out, blocking the strike. He shouted, "Destroyer of curses!" A black orb formed in his palm and flew straight at Verga. Jade released it with effortless ease. Remaining in the same pose, he watched the bullet slice through the air. Verge cried out in shock, not understanding what was happening, and the smith shouted, alarmed at how he could know about that power. The man trembled with fear and surprise, then laughed hysterically. Jade saw how stunned he was and knew the effect had been achieved. Confidently, he moved forward with one thought in mind, to stay alert, because the outcome of the fight was still undecided. He called to his opponent, "Defend yourself." Jade passed Voir, who stood stunned and clearly had not expected this turn. The boy lowered his eyes beneath his bangs and stopped short. He tightened his grip on the sword and swung it sharply at Voir, who froze in terror, too stunned to move. Jade laid the blade on his shoulder and said coldly that the victory was his. Voice only turned his head and fixed his gaze on him. Verge could hardly believe his eyes. Voice was supposed to win, but he suddenly shouted that he would never accept defeat. He cried out desperately that he would never give up and demanded a rematch. Jade was stunned and thought it was too much that he also wanted revenge. Annoyed, the young man thought his opponent might be holding a hidden card. The sudden offer did not appeal to him at all. Jade said that no matter how hard they fought, victory would still be his. Voice became angry because he did not like those words. He shouted that Jade had cheated him and tried to win unfairly, demanding an explanation. Jade was angry and sure he wasn't the cheater. Voice gave him a mocking look and offered a fight on new terms. If he won, he could demand anything from him. Jade doubted the man was serious. The man answered reluctantly that there was no choice, because he would not back off otherwise. Voice rejoiced. Verge stepped closer, hit Jade in the chest, and called out that it was time to act, urging Voice to show his strength and win. Voice glared at the boy. Jade turned and stuck out his tongue, thinking it was all empty talk. If anyone is the real fraud, it's not him. Jade decided he must now win more decisively than before and prove he was not a cheat and deserved every victory he had earned. Sighing, he braced himself. He didn't want to do it, but the plan was already set, and he had to finish everything alone. Jade suggested that this time, everyone go all out and use their strongest spells. If the arena is damaged, let them cover the costs themselves. Verge flew into a rage, declaring that after his blows, not a single brick would tremble. He even mocked Jade as too weak to be a true warrior. He shouted that they had to fight for glory. Jade just smiled and thanked him for those words, because that was exactly what he wanted. Voice roared that the time for revenge had come, his cry so loud it could be heard beyond the forest. Jade stared coldly at his enraged opponent and thought that now, knowing all his weaknesses, he could attack at full force. Voice suddenly widened his eyes when he saw Jade change. The boy announced loudly that he was awakening an all-encompassing energy. Astonished, Voice and Verge stared at him, unable to tell where the blinding light was coming from. They could not make sense of any of it. Jade gripped the wooden sword hard and drove it into the ground. Now a glow covered not only him, but also the weapon, blinding everyone nearby. Voice froze in shock, convinced he had thrown away his blade and no longer knew what to expect from such an opponent. Jade planted his feet, braced his hands on his knees, and took a deep breath. Magic filled his body, replenishing his energy. He unleashed his power. The light grew even brighter. The ground shook and began to crumble. Voice covered his face with his hands to avoid going blind. A deep crack ran across the arena that anyone could fall into. Voice cried out in shock, unable to believe the power before him. An explosion rocked the whole building, sending a column of dust high into the sky and cracking the stone floor. Amid the ruins, Jade stood lit by a light visible from afar. Turning his head, he noticed something and froze in anticipation, ready for the next move. Jade noticed Voice's hand tremble, and only a rasp escaped his lips. Gathering his strength, he began to flail and, gasping, call for help. Jade, still radiating energy, stepped up to him and reached out his hand. Voice did not resist, grabbing it with both hands and clinging to it as if it were his last chance. Rising to his feet, he immediately dropped to his knees and began muttering incoherently. Jade sighed in disappointment, accepting his weakness. Verge fell to the ground, staring at them in surprise. Verge covered his head with his hands and let out a wild cry. Jade looked at him in surprise and tried to say something, but he suddenly jumped up and shouted that the monster had run away. Jade reached out and muttered in confusion. His expression returned to normal, and he thought irritably about where the promised blade was now that he had won. Before him sat Voix, broken. Despair filled his eyes, and he had barely recovered from the first defeat when the second came. Jade watched his defeated opponent nervously and hesitated to finish him off or leave him. His conscience would not allow it, so he simply turned back to the forge. Suddenly, he heard heavy breathing. Turning, Jade saw Verge, exhausted and gasping, running while clutching the sword the boy had wanted so much. Verge held out the blade and told him to take it and go. He trembled, trying to hide his fear. Jade took the sword and answered yes, unsure. Looking at the weapon, he thought Verge had fled with his tail between his legs to avoid something worse. Drawing the blade from its sheath, he froze at how light it was. It sat in his hand perfectly, even better than he'd imagined. Jade raised it above his head. Crystals gleamed in the hilt, and his eyes widened. He couldn't believe it. It was a real power crystal. These stones gave weapons incredible strength, making metal stronger than anything that existed. Jade knew these crystals inside out. Their key trait was unmatched, and he could sense their power in every detail. The weapons could slow time and speed the blade's motion. With 3 S-rank crystals in the hilt, the speed tripled, leaving the enemy with no chance. He assumed the craftsman had carefully worked the crystals before selling them. Meanwhile, Voi's apprentice from the village tried to explain something. Jade sheathed his sword and thought crystals like that, especially S-rank ones, were incredibly rare. It looked like he had hit the jackpot. Verge slammed his fist into the ground and shouted that the crystal was worth 60 million gold coins. Voice, stunned, asked if he was serious. Koval shouted hysterically that he had expected the boy to lose in the first fight, but he won twice in a row. Voice, barely holding back tears, shouted that he could not believe the boy had taken the blade. Nearly sobbing with helplessness, he could do nothing. Jade only grimaced at his behavior. Looking at them with tired eyes, he thought he had warned them. But maybe a compromise was still possible, so he left the arena and headed home. The next day, Jade approached a familiar house, grabbed the door handle, yanked it open, and hurried inside. Gina sat at the table with a book. Hearing a noise, she looked up and turned to face the boy. Jade flushed and awkwardly apologized, saying he'd mixed up the rooms and hadn't knocked. Gina smiled and reassured him that it was fine, and he hadn't disturbed her. With a sparkle in her eyes, she called out for him to listen and asked about their plans for today, full of enthusiasm. Jade gave an uncertain smile and said he had taken the day off today. Gina almost cried when she heard that. She had really hoped they'd work together. The young man handed her a small pouch and said it was for her. Gina, surprised, asked what it was, since she had not expected to receive anything. Jade explained it was her salary. The girl asked, unsure if she could really take it. He answered confidently that she could. She said she had worked very little and did not deserve it. Jade laughed and tugged the drawstring, untying the pouch. He showed her the contents so she would understand he was serious. Inside, gold coins glittered. Jade smiled and said there were only 200 coins and they'd earn more. Gina cried in shock when she realized there were 200,000. Jade calmly confirmed that was his weekly income from non-stop work. Gina held a coin up to the sun, her cheeks flushed with delight as she said she now had real gold coins. Jade said awkwardly that it was only a week's earnings, adding that they could make at least 8 million by next month. Gina was stunned. The boy looked away, puzzled, thinking he could try even harder if he wanted. An idea then came to him, and Jade genuinely rejoiced at his discovery. He opened the compartment right above her head and offered to show her something interesting. 3 spheres descended, and Gina screamed in fear. In a panic, she told him to put them away at once, because the guild had warned that such stones could cause real trouble. Jade just looked embarrassed and laughed awkwardly. Placing them on the table, the boy said there was nothing to fear. They were just magical stones. He spread them out in front of him to show they were harmless. But Gina waved her arms and shouted even louder that she didn't even want to look at them, and told him to take it back immediately. Jade tried to explain they should be seen not as a threat, but as an opportunity, since they can be used wisely and sold for a fortune. He looked away, embarrassed, and said he could always help and keep her safe. Gina looked at him silently, but said nothing. Finally, she hesitantly touched a sphere and gently rolled it across the table, smiling as she said that if he said so, she would try too. Taking two at once, Gina was already happily examining them. Jade could only think, confused, that a minute earlier she had been too afraid even to look at them. She set the spheres back on the table and watched them thoughtfully. Jade said to tell him right away if she needed any special tools. Gina replied eagerly that they would definitely need a sharpening tool and a vertical thruster. Jade nodded and promised he would get everything. He knew the sharpener restored blade sharpness, and the vertical accelerator was a complex, magical mechanism that amplified energy particles. The girl mentioned an oven for cooking, and Jade did not understand why. Jade pictured a small oven with a single cooking chamber. He asked cautiously if she really disliked the hotel's food. Gina immediately said no, everything was fine. Blushing, she explained that sometimes she just wants to cook something herself, and Jade smiled and said he understood. Laying the blueprint on the table, the young man pointed out the grindstone and the accelerator and sincerely thanked the girl for her help. Gina, surprised, asked again whether he really intended to fetch those magical tools. Jade smiled and assured her he would fulfill her request. He added that they would need a lot more gear for the next hunt, and Gina agreed eagerly, but reminded him that today was his day off. Jade laughed and said, "It's true you sometimes need to give yourself a break." Gina replied that she'd go for a walk and maybe buy something. She lowered her head and hid her eyes, then shyly called to him. Jade turned and saw she was worried. Gina smiled broadly and loudly asked him to be careful. Jade was surprised, but replied warmly that everything would be fine. He called out that they would meet again soon and set off. As he passed the high mountains, he looked at his home one last time. Jade sat under a giant tree, rested for a few minutes, took in the mountain views, and then crossed the stone bridge. Jade stopped before a towering cliff that even blocked the sun. Its summit seemed to reach the clouds. He paused to consider his plans. He opened the screen and realized the summit could hold many monsters. But first, he had to check one thing. The young man pressed his lips together and decided to check his data to improve his self-control. He will do it at once. When the system asked for consent, he pressed yes, and a message appeared on the screen. He gained the skill, Weaken Strength. Jade thought this basic skill lowered the strength of enemy strikes. For novice mages, it was simply indispensable because it made the path to victory easier. Jade thought about the scale of force, picturing close-range fighting where raw power stays the same, but a well-calculated strike reduces its impact and lets her slip from the enemy's grip with almost no harm. He decided that using the power reduction ability would not only soften the blow, but also buy the precious seconds needed to counterattack and defeat the enemy. This skill isn't for beginners because they can't manage attack power, so Jade tied it to rank and sharply raised its effectiveness, increasing the power drop by 300 points. He calculated the examples. Without reduction, the attack had power 90, radius 16, and lasted 15.5 seconds. With reduction, it had power 2, radius 50, and lasted only half a second. At last, everything was clear. Jade felt pleased that his rank had reached 25, and he had gained the basic MP level, a big step that motivated him to keep going and try new paths to grow. He realized he now had several skills at once, but using them drained a huge amount of energy, which could be a serious problem in battle. Despite the risks, he was determined to learn to keep his balance and use them as intended. He checked his stats. XP 52,664, 52,486, and everything looked optimal. 664, MP 406, 486. Jade stretched and smiled, thinking many experiments lay ahead, but he would need patience and to raise his rank, so he sat on the ground to gather his strength. He leapt off the ground and raced up the cliff with incredible speed. No more hesitation. It was time to climb to the summit. He created magical barriers one after another, jumped onto them, and rose higher and higher. At last, Jade reached the cliff edge and climbed up. Once on his feet, he saw an even taller mountain ahead. At that height, the wind tore at his cloak and hit his face, and strands of hair blew into his eyes, blocking his view. Pulling his hair over one eye, he tensed when he noticed how quiet it was and decided to stay as alert as possible, since silence often precedes trouble. Closing his eyes, he called out loudly that the search had begun and stood motionless, focused. Minutes later, Jade smiled, having felt the target. He drew his sword, swung it, and saw a black rhinoceros. Its body gleamed like solid metal. The creature spotted him and roared in fury. Jade shouted, doubling their strength, and readied for battle. The metal rhino snorted and charged forward to defend its territory. A broad smile spread across his face as the moment to make big money arrived. He pushed his hair back, revealing an eye with an X mark. Nearby, the girl in the witch's hat, Belladonna, called out in fear and asked what was happening. She was stunned by what she saw. The man in heavy armor demanded to know why the tracking system had not detected the beast, and Belladonna, clearly confused, admitted she did not know how it had happened. She knew her mission was to track down and destroy an A-rank metal monster, and her companion trembled with fear and asked what they were up against. Crying, the girl shouted in despair that it was her fault for letting the team down. A metal rhinoceros stood before them, and Belladonna was certain they would all die. Jade created a barrier, pushed off it, and rose into the air, shouting fiercely that he would destroy the monster as he began sending magical blades at it. Activating the IX, he scanned the beast for weak spots. Marks lit up on each paw, showing where to strike. After landing, he pressed his hand into the ground to keep from falling and watched with excitement as clouds of smoke rose from the explosion caused by his attack. When the dust settled, a metal unicorn stood before him. It still balanced on its front legs, but the scratches were obvious. Jade smiled. He had loosened the monster's paw joints. A timely strike would greatly increase his chance of victory. The rhino unicorn lunged forward, closing in at lightning speed, and Jade tensed, deciding the time had come and that he knew exactly how to win. Stretching out his hand, he said grimly that the power seal was activating, and a dark mark appeared before him, making Jade feel that the moment of truth had arrived. A huge portal opened above the beast, and Jade focused, convincing herself that this time it would work. At that moment, the metal unicorn appeared right in front of his face, pierced his arm with its horn, and tossed him aside. Jade cried out in pain. Struggling to his feet, Jade saw the monster angrily stamp its hooves and stare at him. He winced in pain and felt the impact was strong. The boy touched his wounded hand and activated the healing. The bruise glowed and began to fade, but Jade felt he had spent too much energy. He looked up at the metal rhino watching him and realized he had seriously underestimated it because the monster's level was much higher than it had seemed. Jade checked the health and energy bar and tensed when he saw it was almost full, so he really was facing a dangerous opponent not to be taken lightly. The metal rhino roared so angrily that smoke poured from its nostrils, and Jade decided a few more powerful strikes would end the fight. The charging monster slammed into him, knocking him back. Jade covered his face and shouted to block, and the impact threw him into a rock, but he had no serious injuries. He sprang to his feet, activated the unit again, checked the gauge and smiled. It was full, so it was time to reveal the sun and his true power. His body changed again. Radiating confidence and strength, Jade smiled, released a burst of energy, and suddenly vanished from sight, leaving the monster stunned. Appearing from behind, he struck the rhino with a brutal blow that set off an explosion, made the ground tremble, and sent a cloud of dust over the battlefield. The metal rhino thudded to the ground, a deep dent on its cheek, while Jade leapt up, preparing the final blow to end the battle. Quickly creating several barriers, he shot upward, blocked the sun with his body, raised his leg high, and gave his opponent a stern look. A blow to the rhino's belly sent rocks into the air as the ground began to crack, and Jade looked at the fallen monster with contempt. He left the monster lying in the pit so it couldn't move, stepped aside, and opened the stats screen to check the result. A cold fear gripped the monster, meaning its total defeat, while Jade watched with pleasure as his score climbed from 1510 to 6510. Carefully rereading the words on the screen, he glanced at the surrounding mountains and decided it was time to check the results. Jade noted the results exceeded even the battle with the divine dragon. The storage became roomier, and he decided to upgrade it immediately to level 25. He sent the metal rhino's body into the vault, waited until it completely disappeared, then sighed with relief and smiled up at the sky. His points reached 20,110 in an hour. Jade felt how hard he'd worked to earn that and wanted even more reward. Staring at the screen, he noted with displeasure that an hour had already passed, and the rhino still had not fit into the shelter, which was clearly worse than he had expected. Jade thought it was either a rare species or its body density was far higher than any monster he'd caught before. He looked at the screen and decided to wait a bit, since his SP had increased a lot, and he could now spend them to raise his strength level, which required 1,000 points. He realized the word improvement means strengthening abilities and characteristics, because the whole point of the process is increasing strength and capability. Jade knew that if he raised his rank, his power would grow many times over, and even the strongest monsters would no longer be a threat. Opening another page, he noted that improving the hidden search would cost 2,000 points, a steep price but worth the effort. Pressing yes, Jade decided to upgrade hidden search because that skill could be the most useful. A success message appeared on the screen. He lowered his eyes beneath his bangs and smiled faintly, pleased that his rank had risen and that he would have a clear advantage in fights against monsters. Jade realized this area had creatures stronger than the golden rhino, and defeating them would bring more experience and rewards. He felt luckier than ever, because the rhino had given him several times more strength than ordinary monsters, which was a huge advantage. Jade was glad that the new search let him easily track monsters and know in advance where his enemies were hiding. He realized that unlike ordinary detection, the boosted search for 2,000 and 3,000 points gives almost limitless control, so you can not only track enemies but destroy them instantly. Using his power, Jade closed his eyes and frowned, noting the effect's range was still too small, so he'd have to move farther and test everything there. The band of adventurers stood before a giant metal rhinoceros, and the man stared in stunned disbelief, realizing it was not a legend but a terrible reality before them. He asked Belladonna, confused, whether to run or fight, since only her decision would determine if they could escape. Tensely, the girl said they had to move away immediately. The man clenched his teeth in anger, not believing they had to run from that beast. Belladonna said sharply that he was too strong, They had no chance of winning, and though it was hard for her to admit, retreat was the only way out. The man sighed in anger and decided to act as bait for the monster so his companions could have a chance to escape, even if it would be his last act. Belladonna stepped in front of him and shouted that she would not allow it and would hold the beast herself. The man went pale with terror and cried out, demanding to know what she was doing. He begged for an explanation, and the girl said she had magic and could hold the monster back longer because she had led the team here. She gripped the staff tight, lowered her eyes under her bangs, and told the team to leave her because it was her responsibility. The guys trembled with fear. A tense man said Belladonna should not do it, but she shouted for them to run. The metal rhino turned toward them, and she cried out furiously. Belladonna remembered in flashes. She had managed to shield her companions, but the horned beast was too strong and crushed their chance to escape. She locked eyes with the charging rhino and saw a sign of death, its stare leaving no doubt that this was the end, and she would not survive. Suddenly a hand appeared and formed a protective barrier. Crying, the girl thought she had already accepted death, but a chance still remained. Smiling, Jade stopped the metal beast's attack. Belladonna stared, amazed, at the young man who had suddenly appeared and saved her. Roaring, the rhino charged at the people, and Jade reached out and fixed a stern gaze on the beast, while Belladonna could only scream in terror. The blow shattered the barrier. Jade grabbed his sword, ready to defend, while Belladonna froze with her mouth open, stunned by what she saw. Looking at the beast, Jade told the girl she had been a step from death and that he had arrived just in time. Wiping the sweat from his brow, he sighed, knowing he couldn't revive the dead newcomer and no longer had to. Belladonna was stunned that he called himself a newcomer after everything she had seen. It felt absurd and unreal. She had assumed the newcomer lacked the strength and could not do it, but he had built a barrier that could stop the golden rhino's advance. Jade created a magic seal and shouted a spell to weaken him, and Belladonna, terrified, thought it was nonsense, but he still obeyed the magic. Jade reached out, activated her ability, and quickly began scanning the metal beast. Belladonna sat on the ground, her eyes fixed on it. She thought he was stupid, but he managed to do something right. His health was almost 90, while the monster roared and snarled fiercely. The girl looked at the boy, unable to understand who he was, and still could not believe she was alive because of him. The rhino stamped the ground with its hooves, preparing to charge. Jade noticed it had gathered strength in its legs, and that could work against the rhino. The boy admitted that the strength reduction effect was limited, and he would struggle to withstand the attack, even with a barrier, while the beast was already preparing to lunge. Jade spread his arms and shouted to raise a barrier, knowing he had to try to stop it even halfway. The rhino slammed into the shield, and the boy cried out. The sharp horn smashed through Jade's defense in an instant. She stared in disbelief at the broken pieces of her barrier as the creature hurled them into the air. He whispered through the pain that it was awful, felt a violent blow, but managed to activate the Xi to scan the area. Touching the ground with his hand, he pressed the spot the skill indicated, rolled to his feet, and immediately grabbed the sharp sword. The metal rhino charged at him again, and Jade, breathing hard, leaned forward and, annoyed, realized he couldn't even get a moment to rest. Belladonna watched the boy, worried he had to stop because his strength was failing, and if he kept going, he would lose. Jade lit up with a bright glow as he cast a spell to restore his lost energy, and Belladonna was stunned because he surprised her again. The boy changed his appearance and shouted that it was time to end this, and Belladonna tensed as she realized his glow had turned golden, and now she understood everything. The girl thought with awe that she had witnessed a true miracle, and Jade, pointing her sword at the metal beast, said she had dreamed of meeting it since her first day of hunting. Grinning boldly, Jade shouted for the rhino to charge into battle, and the beast glared at him as the boy pushed off the ground. Jade rose into the air and found himself over the back of a metal rhino charging forward. Then he leapt onto its spine and tried to hang on. The young man plunged his sword into the monster's body, closed his eyes, and exhaled, concentrating all his magic because he had only one chance to succeed. Jade unleashed all his energy and shouted, calling forth a 50-fold boost and the moon blade, and the beast's eyes rolled back in shock. The rhino swung its head from side to side, gasping and coughing, while Jade jumped off its back and watched its reaction closely. The boy hit the ground. A metal rhinoceros crashed behind him, and Belladonna, stunned, realized he had truly defeated the golden beast. Jade approached the fallen monster, placed a hand on its cheek, and paused, for the metal that covered its body was called orichalcum. He ran his hand over the beast's cold hide and realized even the moon blade could not pierce it, so he used the absolute penetration technique. Jade thought the blade had not only pierced the armor, but had also bounced off the inner layers, destroying the beast from the inside. He added that if those conditions recur, he will be able to continue hunting golden rhinos, and then he sent the catch to storage, calling it orichalcum. The girl took off her hat and solemnly introduced herself as Belladonna, thanking them for rescuing her. And Jade awkwardly gave his name, relieved she was unharmed. Belladonna said Mr. Jade, as her rescuer, should listen to her request, and she apologized for her boldness because she still had an injured companion. She said sadly that if it was possible, he might help him, and Jade smiled and looked away because the request did not seem rude. He pointed at the man and asked whether it was him, since he had already treated his wounds, and Belladonna said it was Giza. He came up, said anxiously that Belladonna was alive, then confused, asked if everything was all right, and she, with tears in her eyes, confirmed that everything was fine now. They both knelt before Jade, and Giza said that Jade had not only saved Belladonna, but had also healed him, and he was deeply grateful. Jade awkwardly asked to be helped up. Embarrassed, the young man explained that he was actually just looking for golden rhinos around here, and he felt a little awkward admitting it. Giza said in surprise that nothing had been specified in the search. Belladonna added that it was about the golden rhinos, and Jade confirmed her. 30 minutes earlier, Jade stood on a cliff, trying to spot anything, muttering that there was almost nothing to see. A pity, since he wanted to find prey. Lowering his gaze, he saw a group of people in front of the rhino, brightened, called out that they were the same people, and became curious. The young man saw 3 of them run off in different directions, leaving Belladonna alone in front of the monster, and he was angry they had abandoned her. He realized that with their skills, even barrier magic would not help, because they could not break through the defenses, and he just shook his head. Jade spotted an injured man on the ground, wondered what had happened, then jumped off the cliff, deciding that even if the man wasn't his prey, he'd help. Proudly, he insisted it was true, that chance had brought him here, and he called it fate, saying everything had happened on its own, and Belladonna and Giza exchanged a look of surprise. The girl said excitedly that she wanted to meet the daredevil who defeated the golden rhino, and Giza dropped to one knee and said they were truly lucky. The man said sadly that their squad was labeled low-ranking hunters, but since Jade had saved them, the guild would surely reward him, and he could go with them. Smiling, Jade said it was not a problem. Though he had already gone hunting, he decided to join them, and said they first needed to get down from the mountains. He walked ahead of Belladonna and Giza, who walked side by side in silence, taking in the scenery and still stunned by everything they had been through. Belladonna stared at the boy's back, wanting to ask something but too afraid to speak. Jade did not notice her hesitation. At last, she sighed and hesitantly asked if she could ask a question. Jade paused and, curious, asked what it was. She turned away so she wouldn't see his face and said nervously that she wanted to talk about the recent fight because it was worrying her. She explained that hunters were saying the golden metal rhino could dispel any obstacle or spell. Belladonna said she wanted to call it a lie, but he really blocked all their spells, even the strength-reducing ones, and she knew the outcome of the fight. Anxious, the girl said that it was his skill that proved effective, then fell silent as she searched for the right words. She admitted she had seen his strength fade. Jade replied excitedly that it was a special ability and that he was surprised the golden rhino could clear obstacles. Belladonna reacted in astonishment that he had such a rare ability and became very excited. Jade turned away and awkwardly confirmed it, sensing that things were not going well. Convinced that the golden rhino had no instant lock, he knew no intrusive spell would affect it. He admitted that the spells cast afterward do work, so the monster cannot dispel the protection. Jade touched his chin and paused to think. Answers were still scarce, and he wondered at what stage of this world's development a new level of power would appear. He thought that after the golden rhino appeared, the world began to renew for the first time, and rumors of its ability to deflect attacks spread everywhere. Jade opened the screen and decided to get to the guild with the wounded as fast as possible, but first checked Anton's cursed diary. Smiling, he read about a new ability called Parallel Prison that required level 140. It appeared last in the skill list. Jade decided new skills would be added with world updates, clicked yes, and got a message saying they had acquired Parallel Prison. Belladonna suddenly shouted for him to look ahead, where a monster had appeared, and Jade lifted his head, reacting excitedly to her words. Gina shouted angrily that they had no strength left to fight, and Belladonna said fearfully that Jade could be overwhelmed as well, and the situation was becoming critical. A giant ape was charging at them, and Jade identified it as a shadow monster. Regretting not testing the skill on the rhino, he decided to try it now. The boy reached out, formed a magic circle, and shouted as he summoned Parallel Prison. A black portal opened above the ape, blotting out the sun. The monster flinched at the danger and lifted its head in surprise. He was being pulled inside, half his torso already gone. Belladonna gasped in shock, and Geyser asked in confusion what was happening. Jade lunged forward, drew his sword, and shouted that he was using the moonblade, slicing the air with sharp blades. The monkey disappeared into the portal, but the portal suddenly spat her back out, and the creature stood stunned, looking around, unsure what had happened. Jade stood beside her new companions and watched coldly as the monster tried to figure out what was happening. Suddenly, the monkey's upper body fell apart, and Jade finished it with blade strikes, easily defeating the powerful enemy once again. Belladonna and Geyser were shocked as they looked at the monster's remains, since they had never imagined that could happen. Jade sheathed his sword and sighed with relief. Geyser said excitedly that he'd never seen skill like that, and Belladonna added that she hadn't even caught a glimpse. Jade fell silent, embarrassed. Thinking the skill was extremely rare and almost unknown, he smiled and decided to call it storage, since it could even help him with the golden rhinoceros. Belladonna said admiringly that it was his special ability, and even the earlier move that lowered his strength looked extraordinary. Geyser, embarrassed, apologized for the question, but still nervously asked who he really was and what his profession was. Jade smiled and said he was only an unemployed beginner, nothing more. Belladonna remembered he had already said that, and Geyser looked at him in silence, holding back any comment. The guild's evening lights were on. Sylvia sat behind the counter when footsteps sounded. Lazily, she opened one eye to see who had arrived so late. Standing up, she asked in surprise what was happening and who they had brought. It was hard to make sense of the situation. Geza said loudly that they would explain everything now. The sun had long set as they told her the whole story from start to finish. Sylvia gave a heavy sigh and said that after the Phantom Beast and the Golden Rhino, Mr. Jade also saved an A-rank guild member. She said that, given his past achievements, their words sounded true, and the guild's rules now required her to act accordingly. Jade raised his hand, opened the storage, and said excitedly that they now had evidence and would show it himself. He called her over cheerfully to look, but Sylvia cried out in fear and told everyone to go outside immediately. Jade laid out the bodies of 3 metal rhinos and a golden one on the ground. The sight was gruesome even to a seasoned warrior. Sylvia sat down by the body and asked eagerly how many there were, then leaned over the paw and said the golden rhino had no wounds. She looked at Jade, and he awkwardly said their bodies had been chopped to pieces, unable to explain and only shrugging. Sylvia asked whether their shell was actually made of orichalcum, and Jade happily confirmed that the material was perfect, so he wanted to sell it. Back at the guild, Sylvia wrote everything down and announced they would buy everything except the golden rhino. She checked he understood. Jade answered awkwardly that he had. Sylvia added that he should let her know when he receives the correct amount at the main building, and he agreed, though he thought to himself that she gets angry every time something goes wrong. Stepping outside, Belladonna said they had reported the incident to the guild and that he would receive a reward. Jade smiled and said he understood. She said sincerely that she was deeply grateful to him for saving everyone, because they were all alive and uninjured. Jade waved his hands awkwardly and said they'd been saying thank you for 10 minutes, though he wouldn't turn down money since extra coins are always welcome. Smiling, Geza said they were nowhere near him, a man who calmly looks golden rhinos in the eye and is simply an incredible fighter. Jade waved goodbye to them. Belladonna and Geza waved back. They wanted to get home quickly and rest after everything. Returning to the guild, Jade met Sylvia carrying a lantern. She smiled and said the money had already been distributed. He awkwardly said goodbye, and she cheerfully replied that everything was fine. Jade followed Sylvia as she lit his path. They entered a room with a beautiful tapestry and a small side table. Sylvia sank to the floor and began searching for something. Jade watched, puzzled, not knowing what Sylvia was doing. She found a hidden button and pressed it. The floor shifted, revealing a secret passage to an unknown place. Smiling, the girl said she hadn't opened this passage in a long time, and Jade fell silent, thinking even a guild can hide such strange secrets. They went down the stairs into a dark corridor. Sylvia smiled and said he had probably heard that any adventurer who saved the Rancy group is sure to get a reward. At first, no one believed them, so they decided to check for themselves. She added that defeating a top-tier monster was nearly impossible, but now they had seen with their own eyes a golden rhino fall to the magic of a single adventurer. She stopped before a wall with another hidden passage and ordered the doors open. Sylvia announced that on behalf of the guild, she wanted to reward him with armor for rescuing their group. She led Jade into a room packed with weapons and armor. He thanked her in surprise, and Sylvia said he could take whatever his heart wanted. Jade looked around, mouth open in surprise. Never before had he seen so many weapons in one place. Sylvia followed in, smiling. The young man stepped inside too, scanned the shelves, looked at an old sword, and whispered that it was incredible, then noticed a pair of gloves on a shelf. His gaze swept over the helmets. Jade thought he'd seen many of these things before. This was a real wonder. He took a book from the shelf, skimmed the pages, and suddenly noticed a strange magical object that might come in handy. Inside the box lay an exquisite amulet with a large stone. Jade felt excited because it was exactly what he needed. Taking the box with the amulet, he approached Sylvia and said he chose it. Sylvia asked again in surprise because at first glance it looked like plain glass with no special properties. They went upstairs. Sylvia asked doubtfully if he really wanted to take it. Jade smiled and said yes because it was exactly what he had been missing. The young man thought cashback 50 found it was incredible because it returned half the energy spent learning a new skill and could even double SP after skill upgrades. Sylvia said that since he chose that trinket, it must be very valuable. It was a shame they treated it only as a decoration. Jade scratched his head and admitted, embarrassed, that he'd taken it from them. It left him feeling awkward in front of Sylvia, but the amulet was too important. They returned to the main hall. Sylvia said cheerfully that everything was fine. After the rhino fight, the guild decided to raise his rank. Jade felt excited and thought it was wonderful. Grabbing the map, the boy saw that he and E were now heading up to D, but Sylvia said in annoyance that he was thinking too modestly. With the document in hand, she happily announced that he was now an adventurer of rank C, meaning a promotion to 2-star status with new privileges. She handed him the form and said she only needed his signature. Jade hesitated, but finally signed, surprised it was really happening. Sylvia sighed and said they were only one step from rank A. A few requirements remained, including going on missions with the guild's adventurers. Jade agreed it was entirely doable. She added that it would be easier for him than for anyone else because his abilities exceed normal limits. Jade grew embarrassed, and at that moment, another girl entered. She called out that she was looking for Jade, and the young man turned. It was Mika, who said she had news about him and asked for a moment. Jade answered anxiously that she was listening, then mumbled uncertainly that the culprit had already been identified. They stepped into a separate room. Mika smiled and said the thief had been identified and that he should be told too. Jade said happily that it was great and even faster than he expected, and he was pleased with their work. Mika said the report and the reward are still being prepared and asked him to review everything carefully. The outcome made her look pleased. Jade watched her and thought the criminal's identity still depended on the reward, which made him wary. Pushing his chair back, he sat across from Mika and opened the document to study it closely. The woman said they had received the full report on the incident. Mika unrolled the scroll and read that the thief was a member of the Eternal Income Organization. Jade froze in shock. The young man sprang to his feet and hit the table with his fist, demanding to know whether it was a mistake. Mika, frightened, replied that it was not. She read the scroll again and confirmed in a tense voice that the information came from vetted adventurers and there could be no mistakes. Jade sat down in a chair and grumbled irritably, "So that's what it means?" Mika looked at him, puzzled by his reaction. She pulled out another scroll and read it aloud. All the evidence confirmed it was indeed the work of Eternal Income. She said they target poor people, lure them with promises of high pay, and then sell them to neighboring countries. This is illegal human trafficking. Jade looked at the notes and suddenly recognized the handwriting. He whispered in horror that Gina had written them. Mika confirmed calmly, but Jade thought she was mistaken. Jade pressed his nails into his hand, angry and certain that Mika's words were only half true and the rest pure lies. He knew Immortal Eternal Income was a vile cult bent on destroying the world. Jade remembered. He realized with horror that those who were not highly valued were being used for forbidden experiments and sacrificial rituals. All the money from this bloody business funds their religious rituals aimed at destroying the world. This is not just an organization. It is a real threat. Jade clenched his fists and began sweating heavily. Though he had the knowledge, he felt vulnerable and defenseless. Trying to recall the events of the day he caught the thief, he searched for an important detail he might have missed. Clenching his teeth, Jade thought that if this was only an average opponent, the real enemies were still ahead. Mika called to him anxiously, and he answered quietly that he was fine. The girl handed him a sheet and said it was his reward, 750,000. They even added pay for catching the thief. Jade smiled and confirmed he was pleased. Mika continued, saying there was another offer that might interest him, and begged him to hear her out. She said a special team was being formed to fight the eternal income and asked if he wanted to join. Jade asked in surprise what suppress the organization meant. Mika responded emotionally that it was correct because his power was already well known to others. Clapping her hands, she added that if he agreed, his reward would increase significantly. Her pleading look said it all. Jade realized they did not even know the full truth about the cult and its military strength. If he tells them what he knows, the consequences could be unpredictable. He wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. Jade tilted his head, letting his bangs fall over his eyes. He remembered it had looked the same in the game, and it made him uneasy. He looked up, smiled broadly, and said he understood, then loudly added that if called, he would join. Mika clapped her hands happily, saying everyone would be happy. Jade only thought he probably hadn't yet met even a fifth of the real cult members. Looking at the map, he realized the organization had many bases. Their current objective was a site found during reconnaissance and guarded by 8 squads. Tense, Jade stared ahead, weighing everything she'd heard and her decision. Deciding the risk was high, he believed that as a beginner, he could fully master the new skill, Lightning Void, and then get a chance to always win. At worst, the other adventurers could die, but if he takes part, at least a few people will have a chance to survive. Jade stood up, shoved the chair aside, and made up his mind to go with them. Excited, he asked when the attack was planned. Mika unrolled the scroll, said it would be in 3 days, and asked if that time frame suited him. Jade quickly figured he could gather 10 SP in 3 days, and he said confidently that it would work. She handed him a scroll with the meeting place and time. Jade thanked her and took it. Touching the scroll sent a sharp pain through his body. The boy screamed, and a symbol seemed to flare above his head. He fell to his knees, groaning in pain, and Mika crouched beside him, asking with concern what was wrong. Holding his head, Jade finally let out a breath and said he was okay, just a little dizzy. Mika hesitated and said she had seen everything with her own eyes. Reaching out to Jade, the girl quietly asked if he should take a break. He brushed her off and awkwardly said he was fine. It was nothing out of the ordinary. Jade stared straight ahead and said in a tired voice that an urgent matter had probably come up, and shaken by everything he'd been through, he chose not to open up to Mitzi. He ran down the mountain trail, shouting that he had to hurry. A familiar chill ran through him. The curse had signaled, so someone had used it. Jade sped up, convinced someone had tampered with the seal and it had broken, and he shouted frantically that he had to run even faster. He figured the thief still hadn't learned his lesson, crossing the streets at high speed while remembering how hard it was to get stronger each time. The city was very close now. Jade felt something was wrong and picked up his pace. Meanwhile, Gina came back from shopping, looked at her list, and said happily that she had not bought so much in a long time, so she could treat herself. Admiring the things, she felt awkward, thinking that if Jade liked everything, she would be happy. Skipping down the road and humming, Gina beamed with joy until she heard someone cry out. She stopped and turned, surprised. Ahead stood a man in a cloak that pulsed with magical waves, his face wild as he shouted that he had finally found her. A basket fell from the girl's hands, and the tomatoes rolled across the cobblestones. Gina gasped in terror, not understanding what was happening. Fear filled her when she realized it was a person, and dark energy seeped from under the bandages on his face as lightning sparked in his hands. The man shouted wildly that she had been caught and would surely die now. His eyes shone with madness. Gina went pale as she realized they could really kill her, and, seeing the frightened crowd, thought in despair that this could not be happening right in town. Remembering Jade's words, she believed his curse would prevent him from doing evil, and kept repeating it in her heart. Pressing her hand to her chest, she prayed. The man, smiling with a crazed grin, asked why she begged in vain. A ball of dark lightning formed in his hand. He jerked his head so sharply it looked like he broke his neck, but he still moved forward. Gina couldn't take her eyes off the black ball. The man lifted it, almost brushing the girl. His body suddenly shook. He tossed the bullet aside, and it hit the wall. Gina covered her face with her hands, trembling with fear. Tearing off his scarf, he let out a wild roar and said some strange magic was stopping him. Furious, he formed a new energy ball and charged straight at the girl who had fallen to the ground. Raising his hand high above his head, he laughed wildly and said he would now definitely finish her off. Gina recoiled in horror. The magic orb swelled. Then Jade's angry shout called forth destructive magic, and his strike hit the attacker, who howled in pain. Jade stepped in front of Gina, shielding her. Gina, tearful and joyful, said he had come. After falling, the attacker burst into a crazed laugh and shouted that things were getting more interesting. His eyes glowed with madness. Jade was out of breath after the sprint. He caught his breath and asked the girl if she was hurt. Gina jumped up and rushed to him, holding him tight. Jade stared ahead, confused, and hadn't expected such a reaction. The girl trembled with fear, still unable to believe she had survived. Jade closed her eyes to steady herself and gather her thoughts. He said someone had changed the curse, so it only worked partially. Gina didn't want to let him go, but she had to. After she stepped back a little, Jade smiled, put his hands on her shoulders, and promised he would neutralize the enemy this time and protect her. Gina looked at him anxiously, then tilted her head and quietly asked if he was sure he wouldn't lose. She never heard an answer. A young man saw tomatoes and other groceries scattered at Gina's feet, opened the storage compartment, put the groceries inside, then turned away and said everything was fine. Jade looked at the girl and loudly assured her he was not going to die, so he would still get to taste her cooking. Gina blushed and replied seriously that it was a promise. He swung his sword and shouted a spell while Gina stepped aside and began cheering him on, truly believing he would win. Jade summoned the power of the Xi. He shouted for Gina to get away immediately. She nodded confidently, said she understood, and stepped back quickly. The madman created a new magic orb, laughed, said he felt a real seriousness in it, and mocked that he would withstand it. Jade said calmly that she was destroying magic. The orb dissolved in mid-air, and the enemy roared in fury that it was the second time, and his patience had run out. He howled wildly, his whole body trembling with tension. Jade noticed currents of electricity coursing through him, piercing every muscle. He frowned when he realized it was punitive synergy, the ugliest kind of body modification that lets you use curses as weapons. Instead of punishing criminals with electric shocks, this technique directed electricity to control muscles, mixed it with magical energy, and created a terrifying force. Jade watched the enemy pull off his scarf as sparks ran ever thicker through the man's body. He knew the risk of that technique was enormous and deadly. The attacker tore off the scarf and began to deform. Jade thought grimly that the pain after such a modification was unbearable, and that 99% of people die from shock. Even survivors are left crippled. Meanwhile, the enemy's body began to grow unnaturally, its muscles swelling with terrible strength. Jade watched him grow taller and broader, turning into a creature with grotesque muscles and wild eyes. Taunting him, the enemy stuck out his tongue and lunged forward with his hand raised to strike. Jade tightened his grip on the sword and braced himself. Activating the Xi, he was surprised the attack arrived in just 0.4 seconds, but he managed to fend it off. The monster struck, but Jade dodged, and the blow shattered the ground to pieces. The boy tensed, thinking the enemy's power was incredible, and it bared its teeth fiercely. The monster clenched its fist and lunged forward again. Jade raised his hands and held the sword out, preparing a barrier. The enemy broke through his guard and struck him in the stomach, sending the boy flying several meters. Jade slammed into the house wall, but despite the pain, refused to give up. Dropping to one knee, he gripped his sword to stay upright and smiled through his teeth, thinking the enemy had not only speed, but brutal strength. Jade watched him, thinking that if the plan succeeded, this story would become a legend. He accessed the vault. A magical stone fell from the portal. The enemy glanced in surprise and emitted even more lightning. Jade took the stone in his hand and smiled, asking whether he really believed it was a prayer. He lunged at him, laughing, and shouted that he would die even in prayer. Jade loudly called for change and focused on the plan. Suddenly, the stone glowed, stopping the monster's attack. The creature froze, and Jade realized the old curse could really be dispelled by change. When the enemy struck again, Jade raised a barrier. The blow hit the barrier and did not reach him, though it looked like it would break through. The enemy roared, demanding to know what he had done. Jade looked at the mark on the enemy's body and realized that even if he couldn't remove the curse completely, it had already lost its power. He drove a hard kick into the monster's face and felt it slow down. The opponent weakened. He wheezed and fell. Jade drew his sword and activated the Moonblade technique, swinging with all his strength. The strike pierced the enemy, and he stared at Jade in horror as unbearable pain washed over him. Jade waited for the dust to settle, hoping the fight was over so he could move on. Suddenly, the cursed man lunged at Jade, striking him with a sinister smile and driven by a fierce desire to destroy the boy. Jade covered his face with his hands, but the blow still struck him. He laughed and landed the final blow, sending his opponent far back. The monster stuck out its tongue and croaked that he had no chance. Jade, with his eyes closed, said calmly, "Kakushi Muso." His appearance changed again. Slinging the sword over his shoulder, he smiled and said this was only the beginning. Then opened the Xi. Two opponents locked eyes and both smiled. Neither intended to lose. They would fight to the end. Jade kept her eyes on the enemy. The enemy bellowed that the beginning was nonsense and charged forward. He swung, but Jade didn't even move. The strike cut the air, and the boy had already sensed the attack from behind. Doing a backflip, he avoided the blow. The tile under his feet crumbled, and Jade shot up and landed on the roof of the house. The cursed one refused to wait. Jade tightened his grip on the sword and unleashed his magic as the enemy summoned new monsters. Someone swung at his head, but the boy dodged easily. The next attacks missed too, and he parried them with ease. Kakushi rained blows, but Jade dodged again and again. His speed outpaced the opponent and gave him the advantage. He roared in fury, coming just short of grabbing him. Jade watched silently. Kakushi jumped high, forming lightning orbs. Jade opened the vault and summoned a portal directly beneath him. From there, he seized the magic stone, placed it in his palm, and summoned the power of change. The enemy screamed in pain as his body convulsed, then began frantically hurling electric spheres to wound Jade. The boy released his energy and raised his sword, summoning the Moonblade. Its tip flashed, aimed at the cursed one. Bullets scattered and faded into the air. Pain filled the opponent's muscles as Jade himself shattered his attacks. A sweep of his sword across Kakusha's arm forced him to double over in pain, and during the fight, the house's roof became riddled with holes. Jade said firmly that victory was out of reach. The enemy lowered his head, but clenched his fists, refusing to accept it. Seeing the marks of his wounds on the ground, he suddenly smiled and came up with a new, devious idea. Raising his head, Kikuchi said with hatred that Jade was a fool, and everyone was stunned that he had said it. He roared that if he did not win, he would destroy the star. Jade, stunned, asked which star he meant, but heard no answer, only a scream. The enemy unleashed all the lightning at once. Jade shielded himself and realized the energy was too intense. He prepared to self-destruct. Kikuchi, with a crazed smile, shouted that he had lost, but would force a draw, and knows how. Jade went pale. He couldn't allow the star to be destroyed, which could wipe out half the city. After activating the Xi, the young man scanned the enemy for an escape route to prevent a disaster. He had 826 seconds until the explosion. The incomparable force lasted only 12 seconds. There was almost no time. Jade lunged forward, quickly closing the distance. He had to act immediately, even if there was almost no chance left. He shot forward like lightning and struck Kakusha. Kakusha stared at him, stunned and unprepared for the sudden force. Jade's sword pierced his stomach. Kikuchi coughed up blood and threw his head back, stunned by the force of the blow. Jade kicked Kakusha hard in the head, pouring all his energy into the strike to inflict decisive wounds on his enemy. The blow sent the monster's head back, but it suddenly jerked it up and charged at Jade, filled with rage. Jade hammered his face with a series of blows, keeping him from lifting his head, and slammed him into the barriers she instantly created. Kikuchi burst out, and with a predatory smile, asked whom he was imitating, adding that Jade's death was now inevitable. The young man looked coldly and said it was true, and that he would accompany him to hell so he would not fear being alone. Kikuchi smiled one last time, and a giant ball of light exploded in the sky. Gina looked up in fear, not understanding what was happening. Jade fell out of the smoke, plunging down. Near exhaustion, he whispered a spell, summoned a barrier, and stood on it. Descending slowly on the shields, he touched down, sighed heavily, opened his wounded eye, and looked away. Gina, through tears, cried out that he was all right and rushed toward him, knocking him off his feet to hug him. Surprised, the boy's eyes widened, and the girl cried into his chest, unable to hold back her emotions after what she'd experienced. Jade quietly muttered an apology for making her worry. "It couldn't have been otherwise," she replied, then asked about his wounds. He assured her he was fine. Lying together, they smiled at one another. Jade joked he was hungry, and Gina happily said she was too. At home, she put fried eggs, sausages, salad, bread, and hot coffee on the table. Jade watched the food with delight. Gina handed him a plate of yesterday's soup, but he only smiled and said it was wonderful. He ate everything hungrily and thanked her aloud. Gina cheerfully said she was pleased by his words. She sat across from him, smiling as he enjoyed it. Warm thoughts filled her. Jade teased her, asking if she always smiled like that. She turned away, embarrassed, and denied it with a giggle. The young man put on his cloak and fastened the clasp, completely ready. He strapped on his sword and told her he had to prepare to join the punitive squad. Gina pulled out a box and handed it to him. She had prepared the lunch. Jade was glad and accepted it gratefully. Wishing him success, she lowered her head sadly, asking him to be careful. Jade looked at her and said firmly that they would certainly meet again. Before long, he reached the mountains, where only bird calls and the sound of the wind filled the air. He sat on a rock, ate his lunch, and watched the body of the 20th metal rhino, dreaming of meeting the golden one again. After putting the box back in storage, he decided this was no time for luxuries and needed to focus on earning SP. A new monster appeared before him, a huge skeleton with an eye in its chest and a scythe in its hands. Jade admitted, stunned, that it was an even more valuable prize than the golden rhino, a rare magical beast associated with metal and death. He pulled the sword from his stash and threw it into the monster's eye. The monster howled as the eye crumbled, revealing a magical symbol. Jade pulled out a magical artifact and smiled at the stone's high quality. He thought this device could expand his range of spells and was perfect for his magic. Jade opened the screen, checked the status, saw 112,568, and decided it was enough for today and would continue tomorrow. Returning to Gina, he put the magical artifact on the table and said he had found it this time. Gina smiled and said it was a new artifact, and Jade confirmed it was the realizer. Nearly jumping with excitement, the girl said her hands were itching to get to work, then asked whether there were really 100, and Jade replied awkwardly that for now there was only one. He spread the magic stones on a napkin and said some were Iliamines, as she had asked. His hand rested on the table. Jade stepped aside and waved, telling her to prepare for the day after tomorrow and to take her time. Gina replied confidently that she would do her best. 2 days later in the morning, Jade woke in their bed, exhausted and disheveled, finally trying to gather their thoughts. Deciding to grab a bite, he checked the screen and saw that over 260,000 SP had accumulated in 2 days. While getting dressed, he realized that the loot from the golden unicorn would net him almost 300,000 points, and with cashback, he'd have the full 600,000. Pressing the button, he thought he might be relying too much on upgrades, but a new skill like electric flash would let him disappear from sight and move at lightning speed. Jade handed the box to Ginny and realized he might have to use force right away, and his power gauge was filled to the brim. They stepped into the yard. Gina jumped and waved her arms, while Jade smiled, feeling completely ready. Heading out on the mission, he thought anxiously that everything would depend on the enemy's strength and the group he would join. On the field, surrounded by a sharp fence, he found a crowd. Archers and warriors were grouped into squads. A man approached him and asked if he was Jade. He introduced himself as Zane, a guild member and a former S-rank adventurer. Jade remembered Mika's words when she once pointed at him and felt annoyed that it was just gossip. Zane shook his hand and thanked him for taking part in the strategy, since everyone is talking about their squad now because of him. Jade refused praise several times, yet he admitted with surprise that this man was truly a reliable fighter. Zane asked if he knew anyone in the guild and suggested they introduce themselves. Jade agreed. A group of guys came up to him and introduced themselves as the new Patelgia squad, the city's only universal A-rank group. One of them said he was Zargis's killer. Jade studied him and thought NSO killers usually operate from the shadows, so their open appearance here was odd and suspicious. Ares introduced herself as leader of the Fire Spear squad. Her friend joked that he was the senior here and welcomed the newcomer. The other girl loudly introduced herself as Linnea and said they were from the A-rank group Dreadnought. She had found the thieves' hideout, so they joined. Zane patted Jade on the back and said it was his turn to introduce himself so everyone could hear. Jade said awkwardly that he is known as the first to find traces of the Eternal Prophet and that he collects metals, has combat experience, and wields destructive power. Everyone reacted in shock, saying he had the power of destruction, and they suspected it was linked to the third explosion. But that could not be true, and Jade remained embarrassed and silent. He felt annoyed that he'd spoken too much again. Noticing his embarrassment, Zane reassured him it was fine and told them to get ready and go. The squad moved along the mountain trail, and Zane made sure no one lagged, warning that fog lay ahead and the monsters must not be underestimated. Linnea smiled and called out that the target was in sight. Jade stared ahead, tense, and the girl shouted that it was a fortress. She explained that the guards would be standing a little closer, so they needed to prepare for a fight. Zane confirmed, confidently. Jade regarded the guards with icy calm and dismissed them as small fry. The true test would be meeting members of Eternal Prophet. Jade pictured an arrow hitting Lena and thought that if the enemy had attacked from afar, they would have been long dead, but everyone was still unharmed, and that was already good. The girl called to Zargus that there was only one enemy ahead and formed a magic circle. Zargus nodded and said he understood and would follow the plan. Zargus stepped up to an opponent who didn't notice him at first. The man screamed in terror, but Zargus shouted that he was applying a measured dose of northern hydrogen acid. The enemy screamed as pain racked his body. Eyes rolling, he lifted a hand, then collapsed right in front of Zargus and Jade, not even managing to defend himself. Jade realized this was the measured dose, an assassin's magic that injects a chemical directly into the body, boiling the victim from the inside and revealing the killer's true power. He turned away and realized he could quickly clear out all the enemies at this pace. But what mattered more was what was hiding inside the fortress walls. Jade smiled and ordered the inventory opened. A magical artifact, Gina's creation, began to appear from it. Assessing the artifact, he concluded it had a devastating effect on demons. The Iliamenes and Elenizator together amplified magic so much they could take over an entire base. First, they had to use Iliamenes to avoid the first murder. One of the companions touched the seal on the door and said there were no traps. Zane agreed and moved on. Jade snapped at Zane to listen and waved his arms to warn that the door must not be opened so carelessly. Surprised, Zane asked what was going on, but Jade suddenly vanished. Zane only whispered that he was incredibly fast, and Zargus grumbled that Zane might not be trustworthy. Zane said he hasn't personally seen his true power yet, but those who have say he's already A rank, which is surprising. Meanwhile, Jade tilted his head and whispered that he was activating the boundary. Barriers formed as he jumped higher and higher. Climbing the shields fast, he reached the top. With a final leap, he landed on the tower. Jade pulled out the stone and said the name Iliamena, but suddenly dropped it. Zane simply smiled, curious to see what his true power is that has everyone so surprised. Zargus sighed, tapped Zane on the shoulder, and asked irritably if he was even listening. Zane replied that what mattered was whether anyone could trust him with their life. Looking at Jade, he said he understood that if Jade went against the group, he would take responsibility and restrain him. Jade finally arrived and apologized for the delay. Zane asked if they could enter now. He replied confidently that they could. Zane called out the spell, Stone Skin, struck the gates, and the team watched tensely as he opened the way. Jade looked puzzled, wondering why there were no guards here. Zane said they were too careless to leave everything unguarded. One squad member shouted that it was a trap. Cerberus stood at the gate, and Zane and Zargus froze in terror as the monster's three jaws opened. Jade smiled and said he had tossed the Iliamens here earlier. Zane, surprised, said that's why the monster doesn't attack. Zargus frowned. Zane asked Jade directly if he knew Cerberus was here. Jade answered confidently that he did, because his abilities let him sense it. Jade awkwardly said they needed to move on. The wall holds strong magic, so boost stealth to level 100 plus. One of the girls said tracking is their specialty. Jade thought he had to get rid of Cerberus first, and the silhouette of a three-headed dog rose in his mind as he pressed his lips. He remembered the monster had been altered to attack anyone who did not use the particular spirits it knew. One squad member said Iliamees were a weak weapon, and others replied that it depends on how skilled you are with them. Jade stepped aside, thinking they were now beyond the reach of the magical barriers, and he set the artifact down and named it the Elenizator. He knelt and released energy, shouting as he activated a destruction technique. The magic circle trembled and began to break apart. The reaction triggered, and he hit the target dead center. Zane leaned toward Jade and asked, curious, what he had just used. Jade replied, a spark in his eyes, that it could be called the double guard method. Jade thought advanced humans might be created now, and their combat power keeps growing. It's impressive and unsettling. He thought everything would now depend on the circumstances. The minimum actions had already been taken. The girl asked Zane what he had just said, and he answered, flustered, that it was probably like the guard's method. The group stopped in front of a man sitting among the ruins. Jade realized it was time to confront a high-ranking, well-paid member of the organization. The man with stripes on his face shouted, demanding they stop and explain where they came from. Zargus held out his hand and loudly declared he was using medicine from another dimension. The man looked at him in surprise. Zargus shouted for hydrogen peroxide, but the enemy only laughed, jumped up, and said their efforts were useless because poisons did not affect him. Zargus swore angrily, and Jade felt a tight pleasure as he thought Zargus was only mocking and that none of his words could be trusted. Jade remembered meeting similar people in the NSO before, who used destruction methods without spells to unsettle opponents. He explained to Zargus that the enemy was using that exact technique. Although it seemed obvious, he said there was more to it. Jade thought the destruction method worked when the technique directly targeted the opponent's magic or skills, their core components. He thought the medicine from another dimension was a kind of invisible magic that only showed itself when it entered the body. With magical sight, you can notice an energy manifestation early and record it, even if it takes a great deal of power to see. Jade watched the opponent closely and concluded that before them stood a person with incredible fighting power, obtained not naturally, but through advanced techniques. He decided the combination of magical sight and the destruction technique was not unique, but without more information, it was hard to judge the enemy's strength. So trying a psychological approach made sense. Jade pointed at the bandit and shouted that he had tamed Cerberus and would unleash it on him if he did not leave, and the man froze with fear. The bandit, desperate, demanded to know what he was muttering. Sweat covered his face, and his eyes showed genuine terror, and Jade smiled, exactly the reaction he wanted. He was now certain that an official member of the organization could get through magical barriers and inspect the base from the inside, so Cerber was alive, proven by tracking magic. Jade glanced at his companions and realized they'd come this far without even killing Cerberus. The others watched the enemy, tense. He insisted this only proves Cerberus is under his control, but the reaction shows this man's real power is exaggerated. Jade tightened his grip on the sword and thought that even compared to the NSO's experience, it was not worth using his top techniques on this enemy. The squad froze behind him. Zane shouted to Zargus to use the remedies from another dimension magic again when the enemy tries to attack. Zargus agreed. Zane ordered the group to attack together, but not get in each other's way. Furious, the bandit thought it was a total failure. Because of that boy, he now has to watch Cerberus non-stop. Anger consumed him. Zane shouted that everyone would go into battle, defenders included, because that was the only way they could win and save lives. At his command, the squad charged forward. Everyone looked confident, holding the weapons they knew how to use best. The archer shouted and released beams of destruction. Another girl summoned a sickle-shaped blade. Each used their own skills. The sorceress shouted she was forming a glass sphere and concentrated on creating a magic orb. Her partner shouted he was using instant freezing. The muscular warrior shouted he would hit him with a platinum strike, and another teammate summoned a spear that could pierce an enemy right through. All their attacks detonated at once. The fighters jumped aside immediately to avoid the blast wave from the combined strike. Zane stared into the cloud of smoke, tense. Jade watched silently. Zargus asked nervously whether they had gone too far. Zane objected. The smoke cleared, and the whole team froze. The enemy had not a single scratch and hovered in the air in the shape of a lotus. Jade feared the stance signaled something very dangerous. A wave of dread washed over him, but he had to stop it. He sprang up and rushed at the enemy, who still sat watching him. Jade tried to get there as quickly as he could. The man suddenly bowed his head. Jade shouted that he was activating the barrier. The enemy mentioned yoga metal and used a skill. Magical particles shot from his hands toward the team. Jade raised a protective barrier just in time. The whole group watched him in surprise, not expecting that move.